Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. Not every bedtime story is about dragons or daring escapes. Sometimes it's about surviving the sensory onslaught of history's worst time to have a nose. Tonight, we're plunging nostrils first into the ripe, robust funk of the Middle Ages. And I'll be honest, you probably won't survive this. Not because of knights or plague or getting accused of heresy, but because your 21st century senses are no match for the full-bodied bouquet of medieval life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your city and local time in the comments. Seriously, I want to know what corner of the modern world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up on a dirt floor, you blink a few times and instantly regret that deep inhale through your nose. The air is thick, like it's hugging your face, except this hug smells like wet straw, animal sweat, boiled cabbage, and something alarmingly corpse-adjacent. Congratulations, you're in the 14th century, not the Renaissance-y part with art and Leonardo da Vinci. No, you're deep in the Middle Ages. Your first thought naturally is, what died in here? But the better question might be, what didn't? Because in the medieval world, death and decay are part of daily life, and the smell is your constant unwanted companion. Imagine a world where deodorant doesn't exist, where soap is a rare luxury, and where waste disposal means tossing it out the window and hoping for rain. You stumble outside your hut, or maybe it's more of a lean-to made of thatch and wattle, and immediately wish you hadn't. The village road is a mud-slick trench carved by oxen carts, coated in something that's definitely not just mud. Pigs root freely in the filth, and chickens flutter past you, unfazed by the mess. A boy pees against a crumbling wall, while his mother casually pours a bucket of something suspiciously chunky into the gutter. You have to sidestep around it, and there's no curb to protect your sandals, assuming you have shoes at all. And it's not just the sights and sounds, it's the layers of smell. Human sweat, strong and sour. Damp wool soaked with days of labour. The musky barnyard reek of livestock who've never heard of a stable. Then, floating above it all like a miasmic halo, the stench of unwashed bodies, weeks of spoiled food, and the kind of latrine management that would make a modern plumbing inspector cry. Here's the thing. In the Middle Ages, people weren't unaware that things smelled. They just lived in a completely different reality of cleanliness and expectation. A medieval nose was used to the world being earthy. The kind of earthy that makes compost seem like perfume, and they were constantly trying to explain it. One popular belief was that bad smells were dangerous, literal, poison in the air known as miasma. People thought illnesses like the plague were caused by foul odours drifting through the streets. They weren't entirely wrong to associate stink with sickness, but the actual culprits were bacteria and fleas, not just the funk. Meanwhile, the church had its own relationship with smells. Monks burned sweet-smelling incense during Mass to purify the air, and maybe also to overpower the fumes of a tightly packed congregation in wool robes. The holy scent of frankincense was not just spiritual, it was functional, a medieval form of olfactory damage control. And then there's a little-known gem, medieval perfume pouches. People, especially nobles, carried small bags of herbs and spices tied to their belts, or tucked into their sleeves. Rosemary, lavender, cloves, dried rose petals, not just for ambience, but for survival. These scent sachets weren't about smelling good so much as not smelling everything else. Of course you might be wondering if anyone bathed. The answer, yes, sometimes, but it depended where and when. In the early medieval period, public bathhouses were fairly common in some parts of Europe, especially under the influence of the Roman legacy. But by the 14th century, attitudes had shifted. Bathhouses were becoming associated with sin and disease. Plus, they weren't exactly clean themselves. Some doubled as brothels, others reused the same bathwater for multiple guests like a human stew, and let's not forget about the fringe stuff. There are records of people using pigeon droppings to whiten their teeth, or sleeping with herbal bundles under their arms to mask body odour. One recipe even involved vinegar, mint, and crushed snail shells for foot stink. These were not the glamorously weird rituals of ancient wellness influencers. These were desperate measures in desperate nasal times. But here's the kicker. The stench wasn't just around you, it was on you. The human body, clad in layers of scratchy wool and linen, rarely got to breathe. Underwear was optional. Soap, if you had any, might be made with leftover animal fat and ash. Hair washing, maybe once a season. People didn't change clothes daily or even weekly, and over time their scent fused with their garments like some cursed medieval cologne. Now take a second and imagine walking through a bustling medieval market. Baskets of rotting vegetables, raw meat hanging in the sun, fish gutted on wooden tables with swarms of flies competing for a bite. Add to that a soundtrack of coughing, spitting, open wounds and livestock cries, and your senses start begging for mercy. And yet, despite all this, people lived. They laughed, fell in love, raised families, and even hosted feasts. Feasts with boiled meats and fermented bread, served in halls that reeked of smoke, tallow candles, and the unwashed backsides of 100 guests. If there's one weird comfort in all this, it's that people did adapt. The human nose has a remarkable ability to go nose blind. What would make you gag might barely register to someone living in it day after day. Over time, the reek of the world became background noise, an olfactory shrug. So welcome, traveller. You've just taken your first whiff of the Middle Ages, and trust me, it only gets riper from here. Let's get personal. Specifically, let's talk about where you go to the bathroom when it's the year 1350, and the closest thing to indoor plumbing is a hole in a piece of wood suspended over a moat. Because yes, tonight you're learning all about the truly glorious horror show that is medieval sanitation, or, more accurately, the total and utter lack of it. You wake up one chilly morning in your little timber cottage, stretch, yawn, and then realise you need to relieve yourself, and that's where the trouble begins. If you're a peasant, you likely don't have a dedicated toilet at all. You might have a communal pit dug behind the livestock pen, or maybe you just go in the ditch out back and pray your neighbours aren't watching. A chamber pot, if you're lucky. Most folks didn't have one, and if they did, it was just a bowl you peed in and then flung the contents out the door. Sometimes into the street, sometimes onto someone else's door. Sorry, Geoffrey, if you're in a slightly fancier home, say, part of a manor or a monastery, you might have access to a guardrobe, a term that sounds deceptively like it belongs in IKEA. But don't be fooled. A guardrobe is basically a vertical shaft built into the side of a building, where waste falls down and collects in a pit or drains into a moat. So imagine sitting on a cold stone bench with a hole in it, wind whistling up from the depths below, while the smell of everyone else's contributions wafts back into your nostrils. And if you're wondering, yes, guardrobes were often cleaned manually, with a shovel, by someone who may or may not have drawn the short straw that day. In larger cities, things get downright dystopian. Streets become makeshift sewers, especially after a rainstorm when filth and runoff from open gutters flood the roads. Some towns had rudimentary waste management systems, but these were more like wishful thinking than real infrastructure. Latrines emptied directly into rivers, which doubled as water sources. People literally drank from the same streams they used to flush their bowels. If you're imagining a public health crisis, you're not wrong, but germ theory was still centuries away. The connection between waste and disease hadn't quite clicked. Now, brace yourself for the bonus round. The medieval tradition of tossing waste out the window. In many towns, the nightly ritual went something like this. Open your upstairs window, shout a courteous "Gardez l'eau," which loosely translates to "watch out for the water," but meant incoming pee and poop, and then chuck the chamber pot contents into the street below. If someone was passing underneath at that exact moment, well, let's just say you'd hope they had a strong cloak and a weaker sense of smell. There were attempts at sanitation laws, believe it or not. By the 14th century, cities like London had ordinances against throwing waste into the streets, but enforcement was spotty at best. Who's going to patrol every window at dawn? And even when caught, offenders might just pay a fine and do it again the next night. The sheer volume of waste from thousands of people, coupled with thousands of animals, meant that cities constantly smelled like the business end of a cow. And speaking of cows, animals didn't exactly have a designated bathroom either. They just went where they stood, which could be in the middle of the road or right inside your house. That's not an exaggeration. Many families kept animals indoors, especially during winter, so you'd wake up, stretch, yawn, and accidentally step in something warm and squishy deposited by your family goat. No wonder the word barnyard eventually became its own insult. Now let's detour for a fringe fact. In some medieval castles, guardrobes were deliberately built so that waste dropped into the castle moat. That's right. The picturesque shimmering water feature we associate with fairy tales and swan boats was often a literal sewage trench. And during times of siege, when armies were camped outside the walls, the castle's defenders would keep using the moat as their private dump. Some historians even suggest that the smell itself helped repel attackers. Nothing like trying to scale a wall while gagging. One of the more absurd debates among scholars involves whether medieval people were aware of how bad their sanitation really was. Some argue that people had adapted so completely to the conditions that they didn't perceive the smell as offensive. Others claim that complaints about foul odours and dirty streets appear in many medieval texts, meaning people did notice. They just didn't have the tools or the cultural framework to fix it. Imagine knowing your environment is gross but having no concept of hygiene or bacteria. You just accept that the world should smell like warm cabbage and horse urine. If you happen to be a monk, your day might start with cleaning out the monastery's latrine, called a reredoter. These communal toilets could be long stone benches with multiple holes. Think of them as medieval urinals for sitting. The monks, despite their vows of humility and contemplation, weren't spared the olfactory onslaught either. Their strict routines included regular trips to the reredoter, and while it was usually kept cleaner than city latrines, cleaner is relative. You could still smell it from the cloister. The stench of excrement was so woven into daily life that it even appeared in slang and literature. Certain expressions referred to someone as being full of filth, both literally and metaphorically. Entire professions revolved around waste, including the delightful job of the gong farmer, someone who was paid, not well, to shovel human waste out of cesspits and carry it far enough away from town. Gong farmers worked at night to avoid offending the delicate sensibilities of the townsfolk. Ironically, the same townsfolk were the ones who kept filling the pits. So you've made it through a day in the Middle Ages without a flush toilet. You've squatted over a pit, held your breath in a public guardrobe, and narrowly avoided a bucket shower from a second-story window. And somehow, you're still upright. Still breathing. Though probably through your mouth by now. And the worst part? This isn't even the low point. This is just what passes for normal. The full medieval smellscape is just getting started. You've made it through the toilets, or rather, the medieval lack thereof. Now your mind starts to wonder, surely people found some way to get clean, right? A hot bath, a good scrub with soap, a loofah or two, maybe even a little eucalyptus steam if we're dreaming big. So you start looking around for a bathhouse, and you find one, but don't get too excited, because what you're about to step into is a place that manages to be both a spa and a cesspool, sometimes in the same breath. Welcome to the medieval public bathhouse, where hygiene, heresy, and a little bit of scandal all get stewed together in tepid water. Picture a small stone building tucked along the street's edge. Steam curls from wooden slats on the roof, hinting at the promise of hot water within. Inside, the air is thick, moist, warm, and faintly metallic. Not quite sulphurous, but something stale clings to every surface. Wooden tubs line the walls, some filled with water that has seen far too many bodies. There's a faintly sour smell rising from the floorboards. It might be mildew. It might be decades of feet. You stop guessing after a few seconds. Now here's the deal. Public bathhouses weren't necessarily gross on purpose. In fact, they were popular and, in theory, a sign of civility. Cities like Paris and London had dozens of them. The problem was overuse. Water wasn't changed after every visitor, or even every day in some cases. So imagine you're lowering yourself into a hot tub that's been warmed by fire, human body heat, and the grimy residue of several dozen bathers who also haven't washed in a week, a month, or possibly their entire lives. You settle into the water and it hugs you, like a lukewarm broth made of strangers. Don't forget, this is all happening in an era when soap is a luxury. You might find some bathers using a handful of ashes mixed with animal fat to scrub their skin, but there's no lather, no loofah, no scented candles, just skin on skin. And sometimes, more than just skin. Because here's the twist. Public bathhouses had a reputation. In many cities they were known not just as hygiene centres, but as places for a bit of extracurricular activity. Some bathhouses doubled as brothels, or at the very least offered a little intimacy along with your wash. You could even order food and drink while soaking, like a grim medieval version of poolside service. This led to a fascinating debate in medieval society. Were bathhouses centres of health and cleanliness, or dens of moral decay? The church was deeply suspicious. Religious authorities regularly condemned bathhouses, especially as the Black Death rolled through, and everyone began suspecting that communal bathing might be a shortcut to damnation, or at least a very painful rash. In some areas, bathhouses were banned altogether. In others, they quietly kept operating, too essential to shut down, too scandalous to fully accept. And then there's the matter of gender. In early medieval times, men and women sometimes bathed together. No, seriously. Mixed bathing was common in many European cities, especially among the lower classes. Eventually, these practices were deemed too risque, and regulations kicked in. But for a brief period, the bathhouse was like a steamy, soapless co-ed party with surprisingly low standards for water quality. Let's pause for a quirky detour. Some bathhouses had professional attendants whose job was to scrub you down with bundles of herbs and coarse cloths. These attendants were sometimes called strokers. Yes, really. Strokers didn't just help you wash, they were also tasked with massaging muscles, helping you relax and occasionally removing lice. You heard that right. Lice. There's nothing like the gentle caress of a stranger picking bugs off your scalp while the guy next to you is flossing with twigs. Now, from a health standpoint, the bathhouse was a gamble. On one hand, regular bathing helped remove layers of grime, sweat, and occasionally parasites. On the other hand, if someone with a skin infection, syphilis, or plague pustules got in the tub before you, well, hope you have a strong immune system and weak sense of self-preservation. And remember, there was no such thing as chlorinated water or water filters. If the tub smelled funky, you just assumed that meant it was working. So why did people still go? Because honestly, bathing felt amazing. Warm water soothed muscles sore from fieldwork. Scrubbing off weeks of sweat made your skin tingle. And in a world where most days were physically exhausting and socially rigid, the bathhouse offered a rare moment of indulgence. You could chat, flirt, soak and forget, if only briefly, that your home smelled like wet hay and goat. But bathing wasn't just about the water. It was also about the rituals around it. You undressed, socialised and wrapped yourself in heavy linen towels that clung damply to your skin. The sounds were constant. Splashing water, groaning floorboards, clinking mugs of ale, the low murmur of gossip. The air itself seemed thick with stories, and more than a few diseases. And then there's the scholarly debate. Did people in the later Middle Ages stop bathing altogether? You've probably heard the claim that Europeans went unwashed for centuries, terrified that water could let illness in through their pores. But modern historians argue that this might be exaggerated. People didn't stop bathing completely, they just got weird about it. Dry baths became popular, rubbing yourself with cloth instead of water. People believed this absorbed the bad humours on their skin, and perfume powders, usually containing things like rose petals, orris root and sometimes crushed deer musk, became substitutes for actual hygiene, like spraying Febreze on a pile of laundry instead of washing it. So, yes, you could still bathe, but the experience was inconsistent at best, horrifying at worst, and increasingly it was something done in private or not at all, especially during plague outbreaks, when fear of disease made people suspicious of warm, moist environments, which ironically was exactly what the bathhouse offered. You step out of the tub now, your skin wrinkled, your body may be cleaner, maybe just marinated. You wrap yourself in a damp cloth that smells like mildew and rosemary. And as you exit the steamy building, stepping back into the unwashed world of dung and rot, you realise something unsettling. For a few minutes, you'd stopped noticing the stink. You were nose blind. You'd adapted, which might be the most medieval thing you've done so far. You've dried off from your suspiciously cloudy bathhouse dip, wrung the mildew out of your linen and braved the streets again. But now you're curious. Where exactly is all the filth going? Like, if people are dumping chamber pots, waste and rotting food into the streets, doesn't it just pile up? The answer is both worse and more impressive than you might expect. Because in medieval cities like London, Paris and Florence, there was a natural answer to this problem. Rivers. Beautiful, shimmering, life-giving rivers. And they were absolutely vile. You walk down a cobbled path toward the Thames. It's morning, a gentle fog hugs the buildings, and for a moment you think the river looks peaceful. But as you get closer, the fog starts to smell, not misty and fresh, more like a forgotten seafood buffet, soaked in sewage, left out in the sun for a week. The closer you get, the clearer it becomes. This river isn't just a water source. It's the city's toilet, trash can and kitchen sink rolled into one. People line the banks doing everything from washing clothes to dumping fish guts into the current. Barrels of dye from tanneries are emptied straight into the flow, turning the water weird shades of crimson or blue. A butcher chucks offal into the stream. You see a boy emptying a bucket of human waste, the splash almost catching his boots. And just a few feet downstream, a woman's drawing up a bucket of water for cooking. Nobody blinks, nobody gags. This is normal. And it wasn't just one city. Paris had the Seine, Florence had the Arno, and they all did the same thing. Rivers were used for bathing, washing clothes, disposing of industrial byproducts, and yes, collecting drinking water. It's hard to believe now, but people once genuinely thought that the flowing motion of the river would clean the waste. Like nature would just whisk it away. The idea that water could become contaminated by human activity hadn't quite caught on, so every bucket pulled from the river carried a little piece of everyone else's morning routine, unbeknownst to the person using it to make stew. There's a popular scholarly debate here. Just how aware were medieval people of the health risks involved? Did they notice that water from upstream kept you healthier than water from downstream? Some evidence suggests yes. Certain religious orders were known to build their monasteries next to clean springs rather than polluted rivers, and there are scattered city ordinances warning against dumping certain waste too close to public wells. But overall, the understanding of sanitation was patchy at best. Most people didn't grasp the link between dirty water and disease, and the stink was so constant it faded into the background. But let's not forget the industrial angle. You stroll a bit farther down the riverbank and stumble upon one of the most infamous culprits in the medieval stenchscape, the tanner. Tanning leather in the Middle Ages was basically a sensory horror film. The process involved soaking animal hides in a mix of lime, dog feces and urine. Yes, you read that right. Dog feces and urine. The ammonia helped break down fat and hair on the skins, making them more pliable. The resulting sludge was dumped straight into the nearest river. Imagine that little olfactory cocktail mingling with butcher waste and human sewage, then baking under the afternoon sun. That's the smell of medieval progress. You might think people avoided the rivers because of the smell. Some did. But for many, the river was essential. It was a place to gather, to barter, to rinse clothes, to float makeshift rafts downstream. Boatmen ferried passengers and cargo across the water, barely flinching as floating blobs of rotted food and God knows what bumped against their oars. The nose adapted. The eyes looked away. Life kept flowing, just like the river. Here's a weird little footnote. Some fish actually thrived in these urban rivers, especially eels. They were hardy, bottom-feeding creatures that could survive in low-oxygen environments. Eel pies became popular in cities like London, a local delicacy pulled from water most of us wouldn't even dare to touch. You'd think eating something out of an open sewer would be a death sentence, and sometimes it probably was. But back then, if it moved and didn't bite, it was dinner. Now, let's do a quick comparison. Imagine you're standing at the same riverbank in two different centuries. In the 14th century, it's a carnival of stench, colours and noise. By the 19th century, it's worse. Thanks to industrial waste and population growth, the Thames famously got so bad during the Great Stink of 1858 that Parliament shut down from the smell. So as bad as it was in the Middle Ages, it somehow got worse before it got better. By now, your nose is probably staging a quiet rebellion. You thought you'd adjusted, but the river scene just hit differently. You smell wet rot, meat decay, human waste, and the sharp sting of fermented animal byproducts. The air tastes like copper and old socks. A fish floats by, belly up, missing half its face, and there's a child playing near the edge of the water, splashing gleefully, completely unfazed. Because again, this is just how life smells. Of course, people tried to cope. Some wore herbs around their necks to ward off bad air. Wealthier citizens avoided the riverbanks altogether, and city officials occasionally ordered mass cleanups, which involved carting the worst of the filth out of sight, and usually just to another nearby place where it would start rotting again. But without sewage systems, clean water infrastructure, or any understanding of microbial life, every city river was a churning artery of stink, connecting every home, workshop and slaughterhouse in one nauseating loop. And here's the truly sobering part. People loved these cities. They were centres of trade, culture, art and opportunity. To live in London or Paris meant access to things the countryside couldn't offer, and that meant living side by side with death, decay, and a river that could probably curdle. Milk just by looking at it. The smell was part of the package. It got into your hair, your clothes, your food. It followed you home like a ghost. So, as you turn away from the riverbank, eyes watering and lungs full of 14th century funk, you're beginning to understand. The Middle Ages didn't just smell bad. They functioned on bad smell. The rivers weren't failed sanitation. They were sanitation as far as anyone knew. The stink wasn't a problem to fix. It was just part of living. So, you've braved the rivers, survived the bathhouse soup, and narrowly dodged a chamber pot ambush. You might think the countryside would be a welcome break, a chance to inhale something other than a cocktail of waste and despair. But no. As soon as you leave the city gates and step into the rural world of the medieval peasant, you're hit with a new scent palette. One that's earthier, not better, just differently bad. Less sewage, more manure, less rotting fish guts, more steaming cow pies. Welcome to peasant life, where the air always smells like someone just finished mucking out a stable, and usually they have. You trudge down a winding dirt path between fields, passing wooden huts roofed in thatch and ringed with mud. There are no sidewalks, no drainage ditches, and no fences to separate you from the animals, because the animals are part of your daily life. Chickens wander freely, goats bleat from beneath the floorboards, and pigs root around in the same soil you grow your vegetables in. It's all one big, sweaty, muddy family. Let's start with the most persistent aroma, manure. Cows, horses, sheep, each with their own unique signature scent, contribute generously to the olfactory overload. And because nothing goes to waste, literally, the manure is collected and spread across the fields as fertilizer. You walk past rows of cabbages sprouting from a carpet of dung, the sun beating down just enough to turn it all into a steaming, fragrant fog. And no, you can't escape it by going inside. Most peasant homes don't have real floors, just more dirt. Maybe some straw if you're lucky. The walls are made of wattle and daub, basically twigs coated with a plaster of mud and yes, more dung. Now, you may ask, but surely they tried to keep clean? Oh, they did their best. Water from a nearby well or stream might be used for washing faces, hands and maybe feet. But full body bathing? Not a regular thing, maybe a handful of times a year. And forget scented soap. You'd be lucky to have a rough cloth and a bucket of cold water. Most peasants wore the same clothes for weeks, if not months on end. Undergarments were optional, and laundering meant boiling clothes in a cauldron over a fire, so not exactly an everyday task. Plus, hanging laundry to dry outdoors meant it was immediately exposed to passing animals, dust, smoke and, well, everything else the wind carried. Here's the fun part. You don't even notice your own smell after a while. But everyone else? They're a walking, breathing sensory challenge. Imagine working side by side in the fields all day, sweating in heavy wool tunics, then crowding into a smoky single-room hut for dinner. Your body is sticky with sweat, your hands are crusted with soil, and your feet... Let's not even talk about your feet. You eat dinner hunched over a wooden bowl of watery pottage while steam rises from everyone's backs. The room fills with a fog of boiled vegetables, livestock musk, and something vaguely fungal. But hey, at least it's warm, and warmth matters, especially because winters are brutal. People sleep huddled together for heat, entire families in one bed, often sharing the space with animals. That's not a metaphor. If you have a piglet, a dog, or a chicken that needs to survive the cold night, into the bed it goes. So even as you drift off to sleep, you're breathing in a steady mix of wet wool, body odour, wood smoke, animal breath, and the subtle funk of foot rot. There's a fringe theory that peasant women used bundles of herbs not just to freshen their homes, but to disguise the smell of menstruation. Feminine hygiene, as you might guess, was rudimentary at best. Some women used rags, or bits of moss. Others simply let nature take its course, washing when they could. The idea of scented pads or tampons is laughably futuristic. Even nobility didn't have better options, just fancier rags. Now, let's swing back to food, because that's another source of rural reek. Meals were simple: vegetables, grains, maybe eggs or cheese. Meat was rare unless you raised it yourself or had a reason to slaughter an animal. But storing meat was tricky without salt or smokehouses. So most peasants relied on heavily salted or dried foods that smelled challenging. And without refrigeration, even fresh food went off quickly. You might drink ale that's half fermented or milk that's begun to sour and still be grateful. The idea of expiration dates wasn't a thing. If it didn't crawl off your plate, it was edible. One curious debate among historians involves the use of herbs and flowers in peasant homes. Some argue they were used primarily for magical protection, warding off evil spirits or bad luck. Others believe they were early attempts at masking bad odours. Bundles of lavender, sage or marjoram hung from ceilings or were tucked into corners. Did they make the house smell nice? Probably not, but they might have taken the edge off the pig stink. And speaking of pigs, they weren't always fenced in. In many villages, pigs roamed freely. This was efficient for waste disposal. Pigs ate everything, from kitchen scraps to, other things. But it also meant that animals defecated wherever they wanted. Roads, yards, doorsteps, your boots, nothing was safe. In some towns there were actual laws against letting pigs run loose, but enforcement was laughable. Nobody wanted to wrangle a half-feral hog with tusks just because it pooped in the wrong place. And remember, even in the countryside, illness was everywhere. Dysentery, fevers, parasites, you name it. Medical care was rare, and when it came, it wasn't pretty. Wounds got infected, teeth rotted, people lost limbs to gangrene, and the smell of decay wasn't limited to the graveyard. Living with illness meant living with the smell of it too. Oozing sores, infected gums, boils that burst and festered. These weren't outliers. They were woven into the rhythm of life. You sit down by a small fire trying to dry your damp boots and ignore the acrid stench rising from the nearby compost pile. The stars are bright overhead, and somewhere an owl hoots. The air is cool but not crisp, just heavy with wood smoke and the earthy, inevitable stink of survival. You're beginning to realise something important. The Middle Ages didn't just tolerate smell, they were built on it, layer upon layer, day after day. The countryside might not have had the concentrated horrors of a big city, but it was no haven. Out here, life was slow, hard, and deeply, unapologetically funky. You're done with the countryside. Or, more accurately, the countryside is done with you. Your clothes are stiff with dried mud and animal funk. Your boots have absorbed unspeakable fluids, and even your hair smells like it's been cooked in goat breath. So naturally you head back to the city. Maybe, you think, things will be cleaner in the bustling heart of medieval civilization. After all, it's where the churches, markets and city officials are. There must be order, systems, structure. You step through the city gates and immediately understand the error of that logic. If the countryside was earthy, the city is fermented, condensed, like someone took every bad smell from every outhouse in the region and crammed it between these stone walls. The air feels heavier, wetter, and so much closer. There's no wind to carry the stench away. It just hangs, like a sweaty blanket over the streets. You're in a medieval urban centre now. Welcome to the nose gauntlet of your life. Let's talk about how cities were built. Most were organic in layout, meaning they weren't designed so much as they were grown, like mould in a petri dish. Buildings lean into each other overhead, creating narrow corridors that block sunlight and trap odours. Streets are barely wide enough for a cart and a chicken to pass side by side, and they're often sunken below the level of building entrances, perfect channels for collecting rain, sewage, trash, and other leavings. It's like living in the world's least appetising fondue pot. And the density? Oh, the density. Families packed into tiny wooden homes, sometimes with a dozen people sharing a single room. Multiple families might live under one roof. There's no privacy, no airflow, and no chimney if you're poor. You cook, sleep, and relieve yourself in the same few square feet. And guess what? So does your neighbour. You can hear them sneeze, snore, and yes, fart through the walls. That thick, sour communal body odour. That's not just yours, that's everyone's. People sweat, and they sweat hard. Medieval clothes are heavy, wool, linen, leather, and worn for weeks without washing. Underwear is optional, bathing is infrequent, and deodorant is a twinkle in the far future eye of capitalism. So each person you pass is exhaling a unique signature scent. Garlic breath, wet wool, foot rot, and maybe a hint of old ale. Multiply that by several thousand, and the entire city becomes an ecosystem of body funk. The worst part is the sheer volume of human activity crammed into such a small space. Every street corner is doing double duty. Someone's selling fish, someone else is gutting a pig, and just behind them, a man is relieving himself against a wall. The butcher's stall drips blood into the street. The tanner's shop is releasing clouds of ammonia. Someone's frying onions in lard next to a pile of rotting cabbage. And right in the middle of it all, children are playing, barefoot. It's around this time you start to notice the rats. They're not shy. Big ones, little ones, families of them scuttling through the gutters, chewing on everything from bones to boot leather. And with the rats comes the other plague of urban life, fleas. You've been scratching for days now, maybe weeks. You thought it was just bad laundry. But no, the city is crawling with them. On you, on your neighbours, in your bedding, in your hair. They bite, they itch, and they carry things you definitely don't want to Google. Some historians argue that medieval city dwellers developed stronger immune systems over time, due to constant exposure to germs, parasites and bacteria. Others suggest that life expectancy was so short that it didn't matter. Most people died before the long-term effects of filth could kick in. Either way, city life was a balancing act between endurance and infection. If the rats didn't get you, the tainted water would. One weird workaround people tried: aromatic masks. Physicians and some upper-class folk stuffed cloth with sweet-smelling herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint, and tied it around their noses when they walked through town. They called it protection from miasma. You'd look like a cross between a beekeeper and a paranoid florist, but if it helped block even a sliver of the olfactory assault, you'd do it. Then there's the curious fact of middens. These were piles, literal heaps, of household waste dumped in specific city corners or behind homes. Broken pottery, food scraps, bones, ashes, human waste, animal entrails. If it didn't serve a purpose, it went into the midden. And these weren't just tolerated, they were often documented. Some cities kept records of their midden locations and size. Entire archaeological studies have been built around digging through them, peeling back centuries of literal garbage to understand how medieval people lived, and more revealingly, what they smelled like. And don't forget about sound, because in medieval cities stink is accompanied by noise. Carts clatter over cobblestones, pigs squeal, someone's hawking fish by yelling what sounds like a threat. A dog barks, a baby cries, and you swear someone is singing off-key in the distance. This constant din blends with the smells to create a sensory soup that makes you feel like you're vibrating slightly, like the city's rubbing its stress directly into your skull. Now, let's dive into a scholarly head-scratcher. Some researchers believe the sensory overload of cities, the crowding, the noise, the stink, helped reinforce the power and importance of the church. Why? Because stepping into a cool, candlelit cathedral often meant escaping not just sin, but smell. The air inside was still and perfumed with incense. It felt sacred, holy. Not because of divine presence necessarily, but because it didn't smell like horse pee. You duck into a tavern to catch your breath, but the inside isn't much better. It's packed with bodies, smoke, grease, and the sour tang of spilled ale. You order a drink, take a gulp, and realise the cup hasn't been washed. It tastes faintly of pork and wood mould. A man coughs wetly behind you. Someone laughs, revealing teeth that look like tiny gravestones. You look around and realise no one is flinching. This is just how things are, and that's the real kicker. No one thinks it's strange. You're the only one gagging at the waste-slicked gutters, the only one recoiling from the horde of flies buzzing around the meat stall. Everyone else has been marinating in this their whole lives. Children are born into it, breathe it in with their first cries, and carry the stink of the city with them wherever they go. It's not that they don't notice it, it's just that there's nothing else to compare it to. So you walk back out into the crowded street, eyes watering from a new gust of fermented something. You pull your tunic tighter against your body, even though it's already soaked through with sweat and grime, and you realise this isn't just survival, this is home, for millions. And it smells like boiled onions, week-old blood, and people. So many people. You're getting used to it now, or at least you tell yourself that. But even with your nose numbed and your standards buried somewhere deep under a midden heap, there's a new level of horror waiting for you just around the corner. Because it's one thing to live in a world of everyday grime, pit latrines, and goat-stinking alleys. It's quite another to live in a world where death shows up by the thousands, and never brings a broom. Tonight, you're about to smell what happens when an entire city gets sick and starts dying faster than it can dig graves. Welcome to the era of plague, pus and pit burials. The year is 1348, and the mood is tense. Not just because you've been itchy for weeks, or because the bread's been tasting like wet hay lately. It's the sense that something bad is coming. Something worse than the usual backdrop of disease and decay. You hear whispers in the market about villages wiped out overnight. You see carts rolling by filled not with produce, but with bodies. The air smells wrong, sharper, like rot spiked with iron and bile. Even in a city already soaked in bad odours, this is different. It's more urgent. Then it hits. Not all at once, but in waves. The first to go are the elderly and the already weak. Then healthy people fall. Your neighbour, the fishmonger with the loud laugh, doesn't open his stall one morning. The next day his wife is burning all their belongings in the alley. People are coughing, not politely but violently, like their lungs are trying to climb out of their throats. Black blotches appear on their skin, oozing and swelling until they burst. The smell? It's a mix of infected wounds, old sweat, and a kind of greasy, sickly sweetness that clings to the back of your throat. This is the Black Death, and it doesn't come quietly. It crashes into your city like a tidal wave of suffering. Corpses line the streets because the graveyards are full. The bell of the local church rings constantly, for prayers, for the dead, for anyone left to listen. The sounds are joined by the wet gurgles of plague victims dying in their homes, unattended because their families have fled, or worse, locked them inside. And the smell. Oh, the smell. It no longer comes in waves. It saturates. There is no fresh air, only decay and more decay. You want to leave the city, but so does everyone else. The roads are clogged with carts and donkeys and barefoot refugees carrying everything they own. And death travels faster. Even in the open fields you find the same blackened bodies, the same sickly stench. Entire towns are abandoned, doors swinging open in the wind, meals left half-eaten on the table. Dogs bark endlessly with no one left to feed them. Cats roam wild. The fields rot, unharvested. The rivers run strangely quiet. Now let's pause and zoom in on one of the most tragic solutions humanity came up with, the pit grave. Normally a death meant a ritual, a funeral, a coffin, a prayer, and a stone. But the plague broke that system entirely. There were just too many bodies. So the living started digging enormous trenches, mass graves, wide and deep, into which dozens or even hundreds of corpses were tossed. Wrapped in linen if there was time, naked if there wasn't. You find yourself watching a pit being filled. The scene is haunting. A line of carts backed up like traffic, each one piled high with the dead. A pair of clerics stand nearby, their faces wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar. They mutter hurried prayers, barely audible over the sounds of shovels and weeping. The bodies slump in, one by one, thudding against each other with wet, sickening sounds. The air is thick with flies, the ground itself seems to sweat, and the odour hits you like a hammer to the stomach. It's not just decomposition, it's the scent of despair, soaked into every fibre of the earth. Strangely enough, this period also gave birth to one of the weirder survival trends. Plague beaks. You know the ones, those long-nosed masks worn by plague doctors, looking like a bird straight out of a nightmare. But did you know they were actually designed to combat the smell? Inside the beak was a mix of herbs, dried flowers, and even camphor or vinegar-soaked sponges. The idea was that if you could keep the foul air, the miasma, out of your lungs, you might survive. Did it work? Not really. But at least it gave people the illusion of safety, like medieval aromatherapy with a death aesthetic. Some contemporary writings describe the streets during peak plague as unwalkable. Not because of crowds, but because of corpses. Bodies abandoned mid-step, slumped against doorways, curled in alleys. Scholars still debate whether some towns truly lost half their populations in mere weeks, but even the most conservative estimates describe scenes that would be unthinkable today. And the smell? That's the one detail everyone agrees on. Unforgettable. Suffocating. Inescapable. There's even a fringe theory that the psychological trauma of the Black Death permanently altered Europe's tolerance for certain smells. That people became emotionally and even spiritually numb to rot and filth because they simply had to. After weeks of death carts, boiling sores and pit graves, your brain builds a wall or breaks entirely. That theory, while debated, does explain the strange mix of humour, fatalism, and religious fervour that characterised the era. When everything stinks of death, you either laugh, cry, or burn down a leper house in misguided fear. But the real tragedy is how ordinary it all became. At first, each death was mourned, each body handled with care, but then the scale changed. 10 funerals became 100, then no funerals at all. Just the smell, just the sound of bells tolling into the sky while the gutters overflowed. Eventually the plague slowed. It didn't disappear, it just ran out of bodies, and the survivors emerged into a quieter, emptier world. Whole neighbourhoods were abandoned. The streets for once were clear, and the smell, well, it changed. Still bad, but more like ashes and mould. The scent of aftermath. You could walk down a street and guess who died inside just by sniffing the air. Death had soaked into the walls, the timbers, the earth itself, and so you take another breath, shallow and careful, and realise you've just lived through the worst-smelling chapter of human history. Not because of the lack of soap or sewage systems, but because nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to the odour of mass death in a city with no plan for how to deal with it. The plague has loosened its grip, at least for now. The pit graves are filling in with weeds, and the dead carts no longer trundle past your window every morning, but don't expect the air to clear. If anything, it's thicker, less panicked, more resigned. The smell has settled into the bones of the city, and while the terror has ebbed, the stench remains, quieter, but still oppressive. And now you're starting to notice something else. Not just what people tried to avoid smelling, but what they deliberately filled the air with instead. Enter the church, stage left, swinging a censer full of incense and prayers like a divine air freshener. From the very beginning, medieval Christianity had a complicated relationship with scent. To the devout, holy smells were sacred. Incense symbolised purification, a spiritual cleansing of not just the air, but the soul. So as the Black Death smoke clears, literally and figuratively, you find yourself wandering into a cathedral, hoping for some sensory relief. And in that vaulted space, something astonishing happens. The stink pauses, just a little. You breathe in, and instead of rotting meat or hot piss wafting from a gutter, you get something different. Frankincense, myrrh, resinous, earthy, with a sharp edge that cuts through the grime like a blade of perfume. Candles flicker. The air still feels heavy, but the scent is purposeful, even soothing. For a few minutes you're not thinking about plague boils or midden heaps, you're thinking about eternity. That's the point. The monks and priests know exactly what they're doing. Incense isn't just for drama, it's practical. When you have a packed nave filled with sweaty pilgrims, coughing old women, and unwashed feet in wool sandals, you're going to need something to cover that up. So the censer swings, a rhythm to the ritual, and the smoke snakes its way through the congregation like a scented spell. It doesn't eliminate the odours, it just wrestles them into submission. And it's not just churches. Many religious institutions grew herbs specifically for their fragrant qualities. Lavender, thyme, mint, and rosemary weren't just for medicine or cooking. They were part of the sensory arsenal against the world's stench. Monastic gardens served double duty. They fed the body and tried to save the nose. Bundles of herbs were dried and hung from rafters, stuffed into linen sacks, or scattered under beds to combat both real and imagined evils. After all, bad smells weren't just unpleasant, they were dangerous. The church had absorbed the miasma theory as part of its spiritual worldview. Foul air was not only harmful, it was sinful, a reflection of the moral decay surrounding you. One particularly odd practice involved strewing aromatic herbs on the floor of churches and homes before important events. You'd walk into a feast or a wedding and crunch over layers of dried flowers, bay leaves, and rosemary. The result? A fragrant floor that fought the rising damp and grounded the festivities in something more pleasant than the usual aroma of fermented human. A temporary fix, but still, a step up. Here's a quirky little fact. During high holy days, some churches would literally perfume the air by burning exotic spices like cinnamon or cloves during Mass. These spices were expensive and imported from faraway lands, so using them wasn't just about smell, it was a show of wealth and divine favour. Think of it as spiritual flexing through aroma. The idea was simple. God deserved the best. And that meant not letting the divine nose suffer the same indignities as the average parishioners. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much the church's obsession with scent influenced the wider culture. Did ordinary people learn to associate pleasant smells with moral virtue? Did incense become a psychological safety blanket against the sensory trauma of city life? Some argue that it shaped medieval hygiene habits, encouraging the use of herbal satchels and perfumed oils among even the non-religious. Others say it simply created a bigger divide between the sacred and the filthy. Churches were where you escaped the stink, not where you learned to fix it. And the irony, even monasteries, those fragrant sanctuaries, weren't immune to the surrounding decay. Step outside the abbey walls and you're right back in the funk. Many monastic complexes were near rivers, which they used for everything: washing, cooking, waste disposal. That meant the same stream that bathed a monk's robes might carry his latrine runoff a few yards downstream. And though monks often bathed more regularly than the average layperson, their robes, thick, scratchy and rarely changed, still soaked up plenty of their own smells. Frankincense was a band-aid, not a cure. Even the act of confession had an olfactory component. In the hot, crowded box where penitent met priest, both parties were likely marinating in the day's sins and sweat. Some reports mention the use of scented cloths or herbs inside the booth to help ease the discomfort. Whether they masked the sin or just the body odour is anyone's guess, but nothing matches the sensory drama of a full cathedral service. The thick air, the incense clouds, the glowing candles, the rustle of wool robes, it's almost enough to make you forget what the streets outside smell like. Almost. You exit the church with a faint, spicy aura clinging to your tunic, only to be immediately hit by the usual blend of dung, smoke and dying vegetables. It's like falling out of heaven and face first into a midden heap. And yet people keep coming back. Not just for salvation, but for relief. The church becomes the only place in town where smell doesn't mean death, where your nostrils aren't under siege, where breathing deeply isn't a gamble. In a world where air is often your enemy, the church turns it into something close to sacred. Of course, this doesn't mean the clergy smelled good all the time, far from it. Priests sweated under heavy robes, monks shared cramped dormitories, and most religious types had the same medieval bathing schedules as everyone else. But they understood the power of aroma, its effect on mood, spirit and memory, and they wielded it like incense-swinging ninjas in the fight against the great medieval reek. So now, when you catch the scent of burning frankincense curling through a narrow window, you know what it means. Not just prayer or piety, but a tactical strike against the endless funk of the outside world. A bit of holy smoke in a world that badly needs it. You're back outside now, the incense still lingering faintly in your clothes, like a ghost of cleanliness clinging to your neckline. But the moment you round the corner past the apothecary's stall and into the main square, that trace is immediately overpowered. It's not even lunchtime, and the street already smells like a livestock parade got caught in a heatwave and never left. You follow your nose toward the source, and there it is. Animals. Everywhere. Welcome to the medieval city's open-air barnyard, where pigs have the right of way and no one has invented a pooper scooper. Here's something they don't show you in medieval-themed TV shows. Towns were absolutely swarming with animals. Not just dogs and cats, but full-on farm creatures. Chickens flapping across alleyways, goats tied to posts, nibbling on rotting cabbages, horses clopping by, dropping generous souvenirs with every step. And pigs. Oh, the pigs. These were not cute, cartoonish truffle hunters. They were massive, mud-caked beasts with sharp tusks and zero fear. They lived in the streets, ate whatever they could find, and relieved themselves wherever they felt like it, which was usually right in front of someone's doorstep. You've probably stepped in pig poop at least 6 times today without noticing. That's just the baseline experience of walking around. The smell, a rich blend of sour dung, damp straw, spoiled food scraps, and animal sweat. If your eyes aren't watering yet, it's only because they've already resigned themselves to the situation. Now you might ask, why didn't people build stables or barns outside the city? Good question. The answer, convenience and survival. These animals weren't pets. They were assets, meat on legs, walking composters. Some of them even served as medieval sanitation systems. Pigs especially were prized for their ability to eat anything, including human waste, rotting food, even the occasional small corpse. That's right. There are documented cases of pigs in medieval towns feasting on dead bodies that no one had gotten around to burying yet. It's both horrifying and, from a certain angle, efficient. The pig was a one-creature garbage disposal, and in a world without organised waste collection, that was gold. But of course, that came with consequences. For example, the smell. Oh, and the danger. Free-roaming pigs were known to bite people, knock over children, and chase livestock. Cities passed laws trying to rein in the pig problem, but good luck enforcing them. Who's going to argue with a 200-pound animal that eats everything and fears nothing, and the mess, constant? Imagine a street that is never clean, never dry, and never free from animal debris. Hooves pound the muck into the cobblestones. Droppings pile up in corners and get mashed under wheels. Rain just turns the whole scene into a stinky stew. And in summer, the sun bakes it into a crusty, foot-level haze of stink that rises as you walk. There's a reason people wore wooden clogs or pattens, little raised platforms strapped to their feet, to keep their actual shoes out of the filth. Of course, even the pattens eventually got coated in gunk, but it was the best they could do. There's also a fringe belief that cats were systematically exterminated in some parts of Europe during the Middle Ages due to their association with witchcraft. Whether this happened as often as people claim is debated by historians, but it's true that fewer cats meant more rats, and more rats meant more fleas, and more fleas meant, well, plague. But here's the olfactory fallout of all that. Rats were dirty. They left droppings in grain stores, in houses, in the corners of taverns. They nested under floorboards and between roof thatch. Their urine had a sharp ammonia-like reek, and when they died, and they died a lot, their decomposing bodies added to the bouquet. But let's not let the rats hog the spotlight. Horses made their own impressive contributions. Imagine hundreds of horses pulling carts and carriages up and down the same narrow roads every day. Now imagine how often those horses had to go, and how rarely anyone cleaned up after them. The result? Constant piles of dung, sometimes ankle-deep in busy areas. And when it rained, the mixture of water, manure and mud created a sticky mess that clung to everything. Clothes, wheels, children's faces if they fell over. You start to understand why medieval people didn't have casual whitewear. Here's something most people forget. Many households, especially those with some wealth, kept their animals inside during winter. You walk into a merchant's home, and there's a goat tied up near the hearth warming its hooves. The back room might house chickens, especially if they're laying, and the piglet, that's in a wooden pen near the food stores. These weren't barns, they were just the back half of the house. So when the fire gets going and the smoke fills the room, you're treated to a scent experience that's equal parts scorched wool, stale sweat, old soup, and gently steaming manure. Scholars debate whether the average person even noticed the smell anymore. Some suggest that people of the time simply didn't process odours the way we do, that their brains filtered it all, out like background noise. Others believe the constant presence of foul smells created a kind of cultural olfactory tolerance. A high bar for what counted as bad. A little pig waste? No big deal. Someone vomiting in the gutter? Par for the course. But a fresh rotting corpse? Okay, that might draw some attention. Let's not forget the soundscape. Animals don't just smell, they make noise. The city is a non-stop chorus of bleats, grunts, clucks and whinnies. You try to fall asleep at night and some donkey is hee-hawing 3 feet from your window while a pack of dogs tears through a pile of bones outside. It's not just a physical overload, it's sensory anarchy. Yet even in this chaos, there's order of a kind. People know whose pigs are whose, they know which goose belongs to which neighbour, and they have systems, fines for letting your cow trample someone's herb garden, informal agreements about who cleans which stretch of road. It's messy, but it works. In the same way that a junk drawer works, even if no one can explain how. So you stand in the city square, nostrils flared against the latest wave of pig funk, and it dawns on you. This isn't just filth. It's infrastructure. It's economy. It's lunch, transportation, warmth, and sanitation. All rolled into a hairy, hoofed, and very aromatic package. And like everything else in the Middle Ages, it stinks not because anyone wanted it to, but because no one could afford to do it differently. It's one thing to walk through the Middle Ages and smell the world around you. It's another to be a part of it. And now, unfortunately for your nose and everyone else's, that moment has arrived. You've been here long enough that your own body has become an instrument in this great foul symphony. And tonight, we're going to talk about that most unavoidable of truths. The medieval body. Yours. Sweaty, itchy, sour and encased in layers of wool that haven't seen a wash tub since the last lunar eclipse. You start to notice it when you try to sleep. Your tunic clings damply to your back, your underarms are fused with your shirt in a way that feels medically concerning, and your feet. They smell like they've been fermenting in a sheep pen, which, honestly, might be an improvement. The straw-stuffed mattress beneath you crackles when you shift, releasing a faint whiff of mildew, mouse droppings, and something that might be pickled onions or a dead rat. You're not sure which is worse. Now let's talk hygiene, or the medieval interpretation of it. Daily washing? Rare. You might splash your face with cold water in the morning and rub your hands with a damp cloth before dinner. Full body baths? A couple times a year, if that. More often if you're wealthy or live near a stream, but even then the bathwater is usually shared and reused. And soap? If you have it, it's harsh, lye-based, and smells like last week's bacon grease. Forget shampoo. People washed their hair by brushing out the dirt and applying powders to absorb the oils. That's right. You're basically dry cleaning your scalp with crushed herbs and ashes. Your clothes are no help either. Most people owned one or two outfits, tops. A woolen tunic and some kind of linen underlayer if you're lucky. Underwear wasn't standard. Many peasants went without it entirely. Instead, they wore long shirts that doubled as sleeping garments and casual day wear. And guess how often those got washed? Maybe once a month? Maybe. Usually only when they got so stiff with sweat, oil and mystery stains that they could stand up on their own. And it's not just your body, it's everyone's. The street, the market, the church pew. Everything and everyone smells like a combination of unwashed flesh, stale urine, wool grease, and whatever they last ate. You walk into a room and it hits you like a gust from a medieval locker room. Garlic breath, body odour, sour beer sweat, and feet that have not breathed since the Crusades. You can actually taste the funk in the air. This is where perfumes come in. Not just fancy floral sprays for noble ladies, but herbal satchels, pomanders, and aromatic oils. You see a merchant with a pouch tied to his belt. Not money, but lavender and sage. A noblewoman dabs rosewater on her wrists before a feast. The point isn't to smell good necessarily, it's to smell less bad. To push the cloud of decay back a few inches, to give your nose a fighting chance. Some people even tuck scented handkerchiefs into their collars, or carry ornate containers filled with crushed herbs to sniff when the world gets overwhelming. It's the medieval equivalent of carrying Vicks Vapor Rub on a stick. One weird little fringe habit. Some people believed rubbing your body with vinegar helped mask odour and protect you from illness. You'd soak a rag in vinegar, scrub yourself down and call it a day. If you were particularly fancy, you might add rosemary or mint. Did it work? Not really, but it was better than nothing. At least it killed a few surface-level germs and made you smell like a sour salad for a few hours. Of course, not all body smells were created equal. The upper classes had more options. Fine linen undergarments, perfumed oils, and even access to imported soaps. But even nobles stank by modern standards. Their heavy gowns trapped heat and sweat. Their feasts gave them chronic indigestion, hello sulphurous belches, and their toiletries included things like tooth-cleaning powders made from ground bone or chalk. And since they rarely brushed their teeth, at best they rubbed them with a cloth. You can imagine what noble breath smelled like after 3 courses of roast lamb, garlic sauce, and spiced ale. Which brings us to breath. Oh, the breath. Medieval diets didn't help the cause. People ate a lot of onions, leeks, and fermented food. Without dental care, most adults had rotting teeth, abscesses, or worse. Toothache wasn't just a nuisance, it was a lifestyle. You'd lose teeth young, chew with your gums, and quietly hope your dinner was soft enough to avoid bleeding. Mouthwash, not a thing. Mouth rot, very much a thing. There's actually a fascinating scholarly debate about whether people in the Middle Ages perceived bad breath the same way we do. Some argue that halitosis was so common it didn't register as a problem, unless it came from someone with a visible illness. Others believe chronic bad breath was considered a sign of disease or moral corruption, especially in religious contexts. There are records of priests recommending herbal rinses for foul vapours of the mouth, which in practice probably just made the death breath smell like licorice. You know what's ironic? In some cases, being too clean made you suspicious. People believed that bathing too often could weaken the body or open your pores to disease. A shiny, well-scrubbed person might be seen as vain, decadent, or even morally lax. Dirt, sweat, and a crusty shirt meant you were humble, hard-working, and maybe even blessed. So you go on with your day, marinating in yourself, gradually becoming aware that your armpits have gone from damp to swampy to possibly haunted. You walk through the market, and every time someone lifts their arm to gesture, wave, or threaten, a fresh gust of personalised human stench sails your way. And there's no escape. No showers to run to, no clean socks to change into. You are the smell. You carry it like a second skin, layered with smoke, garlic, hay, and regret. And strangely, you start to get used to it. Not because it's pleasant, but because it's everywhere. You start to recognise people by their smell before they even turn the corner. You know your neighbour by the sharp tang of fish and pipe smoke. Your friend smells like wood ash and old cheese. You begin to understand that in the Middle Ages, identity was as much about scent as sight or sound. And once that sinks in, you realise something terrifying. You're starting to smell like you belong here. You've gone nose blind to your own funk, which feels like a victory, until you realise it just means you can smell everyone else even more clearly. And tonight, you're attending a noble banquet. A rare chance to peek behind the velvet curtain and into the lives of the people who don't sleep next to their chickens. You might expect the rich to smell like roses and luxury, but spoiler alert, money doesn't cancel out biology. It just masks it in layers and layers of very expensive perfume. The banquet hall is everything you imagined. Grand arches, tapestries on the walls, long wooden tables groaning under the weight of roasted animals, stewed fruits, flagons of ale, and steaming bread. Candles flicker, music plays, and nobles sit shoulder to shoulder in an environment that, under different circumstances, might be romantic. Except, there it is again. That familiar medieval undercurrent. Heat, sweat, leather, breath. Wealthy, yes, but still very much alive. And by alive, we mean sweaty and bacteria-rich. Let's talk medieval perfume. The wealthy didn't bathe much more often than the poor, maybe slightly more, if they had access to heated water and servants to haul it. But they did have one crucial advantage: fragrance. Nobles doused themselves in oils and tinctures made from rose, musk, ambergris, a waxy substance regurgitated by whales, no really, civet, glandular secretions from a cat-like animal, and spikenard. These weren't subtle. They weren't hints of lemon zest or whispers of lilac. They were statements. You could smell a noble coming long before you saw the embroidery on their cloak. These perfumes served multiple purposes. 1, to impress. 2, to overwhelm. And 3, to act as a sort of force field against the miasma. If bad air carried disease, then good-smelling air had to protect you, right? So they didn't just apply perfume, they wore it. Cloaks were lined with perfume sachets, sleeves contained hidden pockets of herbs, and some even wore amulets filled with sweet-smelling oils around their necks. Entire wardrobes were scented like a bizarre blend of spice rack and funeral parlour. You sit between two nobly born banquet attendees, and it's immediately clear they've each committed to different olfactory strategies. On your left is a man who reeks of clove oil and sweat, like someone dropped a ham into a spice chest and set it on fire. On your right is a woman doused in violet water so aggressively that every breath you take feels like inhaling an entire garden in bloom, and maybe also a touch of mothballs. Mixed with the natural aroma of cooked meats, spilled wine, and roaring hearths, the atmosphere becomes a kind of medieval potpourri gone slightly rancid. There's a popular scholarly debate about whether these fragrances actually helped or just made things worse. On one hand, certain natural oils and resins had mild antibacterial properties. On the other hand, layering perfume over body odour often created a uniquely pungent combo, like lavender and long-distance foot rot doing battle in a locked room. Modern historians have found recipes for perfumes that included everything from dried mint to crushed pearls, which seems extravagant until you realise people were desperately trying to stay ahead of the funk tide. Weird fact break. One popular noble perfume included a blend of cinnamon, nutmeg and powdered unicorn horn. Of course, there were no actual unicorns involved. Usually it was narwhal ivory or ground fossil passed off as magical. But the idea was the same. Mystical protection, bottled and worn. It didn't necessarily smell nice, but it screamed status, and that was half the point. And here's something else you probably weren't prepared for. Nobles didn't just wear perfume, they ate it, literally. Spices like saffron, cinnamon and cardamom weren't just about taste. They were believed to warm the body, balance the humours, and leave the breath less deadly. Desserts were sometimes laced with rosewater or orange blossom for that extra internal perfume effect. You sip a wine infused with cloves and realise, oh, it's not for the flavour, it's mouth deodorant. They're scenting themselves from the inside out. Even the architecture gets in on the game. In some palaces, herbs were stuffed into wall crevices, or burned in little dishes to keep rooms smelling sweet. Windows, when opened, weren't just for light. They were an invitation for fresher air. Not that it helped much when 20 people were crammed into a stone room with no plumbing, but still, it was a gesture. The servants, meanwhile, are immune to all this olfactory theatre. They sweep past with trenchers of meat and basins for hand washing, though the water gets cloudy after just a few guests. They wipe down the tables with cloths that smell like damp straw and wine. They pour ale from wooden jugs that still bear the scent of last night's goose fat. To them, the noble funk is just background noise. They've got their own microcosm of stink to deal with in the kitchen, where a whole pig is roasting over coals and someone just dropped a hunk of cheese into the fire, creating a smell that could double as a weapon. Let's not romanticise this. For all the gilded goblets and polished silver, there's no hiding the human underneath. The nobleman scratches at lice hidden beneath his velvet hat. The lady subtly picks at something between her teeth, then wipes it on the edge of the tablecloth. A boy in the corner is retching from too much honeyed meat, and the clean-up is minimal. You start to realise that being rich doesn't mean being clean, it just means you can afford to pretend better. And yet, there's something almost admirable about the effort. In a world where nothing stays fresh, nobles doubled down on the illusion. They made scent into performance art, layers of fabric, perfume and etiquette stacked over the same sweaty, flawed bodies as everyone else. You've got to respect the hustle. As the banquet drags into its third hour and the fire begins to dim, the smells become even more potent. Food goes cold. Wine spills dry into sticky patches. The perfume starts to wear off, and the real scent underneath begins to creep out, one slow, sweaty sigh at a time. And that's when it hits you. Even at the top of the medieval food chain, no one escapes the stink. They just decorate it better. The banquet is over, your clothes are saturated with every noble scent from roast goose grease to powdered violet root, and your ears are still ringing from 3 hours of a hurdy-gurdy solo. As you step outside into the cooler night air, you're hopeful for a breath that doesn't taste like meat and musk. But instead, you're hit with something far more sinister. An invisible force, dense and grim, curling through the dark like a curse. Because in the Middle Ages, people didn't just fear the stink, they believed in it. Welcome to the world of medieval medicine, where bad smells don't just make you gag, they make you sick, maybe even dead. At the heart of this theory was the infamous miasma. Not the poetic kind, the real deal. Miasma was thought to be a poisonous vapour, foul-smelling air that rose from rotting matter, stagnant water, swamps, and of course, human filth. If you inhaled it, the logic went, you could catch anything from a common fever to the plague. And let's be honest, given the state of the average medieval town, everything smelled like disease. So, according to this logic, everything was trying to kill you. You pass an apothecary's stall late at night, and he's still working by candlelight. Dried herbs hang in bundles from the rafters. Rosemary, sage, juniper, marjoram. There's a bowl of vinegar with floating petals. He's brewing something thick and murky in a small pot that smells like mouldy licorice. You watch as he pours it into a ceramic bottle, corks it, and ties a tag. For air, purification, apply to cloth, hold to nose. Translation: sniff this when the world smells like it's trying to eat you alive. Doctors, well, the medieval approximation of doctors, weren't blind to the odours around them. They just had no idea what was actually causing disease. Germ theory was a distant dream. Instead, they built an entire medical system around balancing the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had a fever, they assumed your body was too hot. If your breath reeked like an open grave, maybe your phlegm was out of alignment. Either way, the treatment often involved purging, bleeding, and smelling better stuff to drive out the bad. Let's talk about one of the more famous solutions, the pomander. Imagine a tiny metal orb filled with crushed herbs, spices, sometimes ambergris, and suspended from a chain. It looked like jewellery, but it was really medieval Febreze. People wore them around their necks, clipped them to belts, or clutched them like little olfactory talismans as they moved through particularly foul parts of town. The richer the person, the fancier the pomander, and the more complex the mix inside. Think cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, mint, and anything else pungent enough to knock back the miasma. And then there's the vinegary miracle, Four Thieves Vinegar. This legendary concoction was supposedly used by thieves during plague outbreaks to rob the sick without getting infected. According to lore, the blend of vinegar, rosemary, thyme, garlic, and other sharp ingredients protected them from disease. Modern historians suspect it might have helped a little. Garlic does have antimicrobial properties, but mostly it just made the thieves smell like pickled soup. Still, bottles of this stuff were sold, prescribed, and passed around like holy water. If it stung your nose, it must be working. Oddly enough, even architectural design was influenced by the fear of miasma. Wealthy homes often had small herb gardens, not just for food but to scent the air. Some cities began experimenting with open spaces, early parks, not because people needed recreation, but because they believed trees and fresh air could combat the poison. In hospitals, windows were placed high to allow bad air to escape, and rooms were fumigated with burning rosemary or sulphur. Again, it wasn't totally ineffective. Smoke and certain herbs did mask the smell, but the real culprits, bacteria and viruses, laughed all the way to the bloodstream. Here's a fringe medical tip that people actually followed. Don't breathe at night. No, seriously. It was believed that the night air, cool, moist and unmoving, was especially dangerous. People would sleep with their windows shut tight, even in summer, and wrap scarves around their noses. Of course, this only made bedrooms stuffier and stinkier, but hey, at least they didn't inhale any of that dangerous fresh air. One of the more surreal sights you witness during a walk through the poorer quarters is a healer dragging a brazier through the street, throwing herbs onto the hot coals. Clouds of smoke trail behind her as she shouts, "Air cleansing! For God's mercy!" It smells like burnt sage, fennel, and desperation. People gather to sniff the smoke, clutching cloths to their faces, their expressions a mix of hope and mild nausea. A scholarly debate still simmers over how seriously people took miasma theory versus how much it just gave them a sense of control. Was it true belief, or a placebo for a terrified population? Some argue that the rituals of fumigation and perfume were more about creating emotional distance from death than actually curing anything. Others insist the theory dominated medical thinking for centuries, shaping responses to every major disease outbreak, from the Black Death to the Great Plague of London. And here's the tragic irony. Miasma theory actually delayed the adoption of sanitation. Since people thought disease came from bad air, they focused on smells instead of sources. That meant they burned incense instead of building sewers, wore masks instead of washing hands, and feared marshes more than contaminated wells. Some even feared bathing itself, worried that opening their pores would let in foul air. So the world stayed filthy longer than it needed to, because people were literally fighting the wrong enemy. Yet, in a strange way, the obsession with smell did lead to improvements. Cities began organising waste removal, not because they cared about germs, but because the air smelled too bad to ignore. Laws were passed banning the dumping of offal in certain places. Privies were regulated. Dead animals had to be buried outside the city walls. It wasn't germ theory, but it was progress. Progress that smelled just a tiny bit better. You return to your room, pull the curtain across your straw mattress, and try not to breathe too deeply. Someone in the next room is snoring, someone else is praying, and outside a dog is barking at nothing. You tuck a bundle of dried mint under your nose and close your eyes. And as the scent fills your head, sharp, bitter, slightly dusty, you wonder how long it'll be before someone realises that it's not the smell that kills you, it's everything behind it. Morning arrives with a groan. Not yours, though that's understandable, but from somewhere outside, where a rooster is testing its lung capacity and a baby is already crying. You sit up, stretch, and immediately realise something uncomfortable. Your linen undergarments are stiff. Again, you scratch absently, and that's when it hits you. The sharp, almost metallic scent rising from your own skin, mixed with something sour and slightly coppery. And tonight's story takes a turn that half the population had to live with in secret and silence. We're talking medieval menstruation. No products, no privacy, no chance of a discreet little trip to the restroom. For women in the Middle Ages, bodily functions weren't just inconvenient, they were borderline dangerous. There was no concept of menstrual hygiene products as we know them today. No pads, no tampons, no cups, no angelic commercial voiceover saying, "It's just another day." It was more like, "Good luck surviving this week without bleeding through your only tunic." The average woman used rags, old scraps of cloth, sometimes tied around the waist with cords to keep them vaguely in place. If you were poor, and let's be real, most were, you might not even have enough spare cloth, so some women just let it flow, washing themselves when they could, maybe changing shifts if they had a second garment. Others used natural materials, moss, straw, soft animal wool, anything that could absorb a bit before needing to be rinsed and dried. Imagine trying to do farm work, bake bread, or haul water while a damp ball of sheep fluff is tucked under your skirts. Add summer heat and no running water, and it's less earth goddess and more damp disaster. And here's the thing, this wasn't hidden. There was no secret stash in the purse, no bathroom stall to run into. Menstruation happened in full view of family, roommates, and livestock. Blood-stained benches, bed sheets, and sometimes the back of a dress if things went poorly. And people noticed. There are accounts of midwives or healers using the scent of menstrual blood to diagnose problems. And it had a smell. Warm, iron-rich, mixed with weeks of sweat, wool, and zero ventilation. You didn't just have your period. Everyone smelled it. Medieval texts describe menstruation in the same breath as disease, sin, and decay. Some physicians, following ancient Greek medical theory, believed that women's bodies needed to bleed to balance their humours, because their flesh was wetter and colder than men's and needed purging. If a woman didn't menstruate regularly, it was thought to cause all sorts of afflictions: hysteria, madness, infertility. And yes, they tried to force menstruation with herbal tonics, steam baths, or more questionable methods we're not going to describe before bed. Religious attitudes didn't help. The church taught that menstrual blood was unclean, both physically and spiritually. Women on their period were often barred from receiving communion or entering holy spaces. Some texts claimed that just touching holy objects while menstruating could defile them. So even if you were deeply devout, your cycle marked you, literally, as impure. Which, let's be honest, probably didn't improve your self-esteem while you were doubled over with cramps and bleeding into moss. There's an odd debate among scholars about how much of this taboo was enforced in practice. Did rural villagers really bar women from church during their periods? Or did they just quietly accept it as part of life? It's likely both. Some areas were stricter, others more relaxed. But across most of medieval Europe, menstruation was something women dealt with quietly, with shame hanging in the air just as strongly as the scent of blood and old wool. Now picture communal sleeping arrangements. Entire families often shared a bed, or at least a room. If you were a menstruating woman, you had no privacy, and you couldn't exactly get up in the night to go to the bathroom. You'd do your best to keep clean, maybe slip outside in the dark to rinse a rag in a trough or stream, and then climb back into bed hoping no one noticed. Washing garments was difficult and rare, which meant menstrual rags might be reused for months or years, soaked in lye soap if available, or just wrung out and hung to dry in the sun. If they didn't smell like death, they were considered clean enough. And speaking of sun, one weird remedy recommended for menstrual imbalance was standing in direct sunlight to warm the womb. That's right, early sunbathing, except the goal wasn't a tan. It was to heat your uterus like a loaf of bread and get things moving. Some healers added herbs like pennyroyal or rue, both toxic in high doses to teas meant to stimulate menstruation. These could double as abortifacients, but they were dangerous, inconsistent, and often more harmful than helpful. In noble households, things were a little better, at least on paper. Wealthier women might have access to finer cloth, private quarters, and maybe even personal servants who washed linens. But they still had to wear heavy dresses with multiple layers, making it impossible to do a quick swap of undergarments without the help of a handmaiden and a few minutes of privacy. And noble women were still subject to the same beliefs about impurity. Imagine wearing a velvet gown, hosting a feast, while quietly panicking that you're bleeding through 12 layers of brocade and linen. And perfume, it wasn't just a luxury, it was your only real defense against the biological truth trying to seep through the seams. One fringe theory suggests some women used medicinal-smelling herbs tucked into their clothing, not just to help with cramping or to mask odour, but as magical protection. In folklore, menstrual blood was powerful, dangerous even. Some believed it could ruin crops, sicken animals, or curse men. Others thought it was a source of fertility magic. It all depended on who you asked. Either way, the average woman walked a tightrope between being feared for her power and shamed for her biology. So tonight, as you lie back and try to get comfortable on a lumpy straw mattress shared with two sisters, a toddler and a mostly blind sheep, you become acutely aware of the fabric between your legs. It's scratchy, damp, starting to chafe. You wonder if the bundle will hold through the night, or if you'll have to wash your only dress again in cold water behind the tavern. And even though no one says a word, you can feel the eyes. They don't need to ask, they can smell it too. And that, more than anything, defines the experience. Not the mess, not the discomfort, but the fact that your own body is a source of public odour, unavoidable, unhideable, and unjustly shamed. In a world that already stinks, being a menstruating woman meant you carried your own special brand of scrutiny, one drop at a time. By now, you've got the lay of the land, the cramped streets, the pit latrines, the endless animals, the cloud of perfume and vinegar battling miasma with all the enthusiasm of a drunk fencing match. But tonight you're taking a step up, or at least up some stone steps, because you're visiting a castle. Finally. Walls, towers, guards, feasting halls, and, if you're lucky, a break from the overwhelming nose carnival of the peasant and merchant classes. But before you start imagining scented tapestries and hot baths in gold basins, let me gently correct your fantasy. Medieval castles were strongholds, yes, but also highly sophisticated echo chambers for every bad smell trapped inside their damp, draughty stones. You arrive just after sundown. The guard at the gatehouse gives you a long, squinty look and waves you through with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for barn inspections. The first thing that hits you inside the castle walls isn't awe or majesty, it's mildew. Damp air clings to everything. Stone walls sweat in the cool night. You breathe in deeply, expecting the crisp, noble scent of oak beams and order, and instead get a whiff of old moss, stale fire smoke, and something vaguely rodent-related. It's like walking into a cave that's recently hosted a cheese festival in a minor flood. You're led inside by a servant carrying a sputtering torch. The halls are dim and narrow. Every surface seems to absorb smell and radiate it back in waves. Unlike city homes, where the stink escapes through thin walls or open windows, castle interiors hold it. Tapestries, rushes, woolen furniture, these are not scent-neutral materials. They soak up everything. Body odour, smoke from the hearth, the occasional vomit stain and the persistent tang of wet dog. Even the rushes on the floor, meant to add softness and insulation, are a problem. These aren't pristine sprigs of mint or lavender. They're trampled, half-rotted and mixed with animal droppings, bits of food and all the fine leavings a medieval dinner party produces. You're shown to a great hall where dinner is being served. A roaring fire dominates the space, sending up black smoke that doesn't so much leave the room as settle in the rafters. The scent of roasted meat fills the air, but it's not quite enough to overpower the background funk. Picture a buffet in a basement locker room. There are nobles and knights seated at long trestle tables, all heavy fabrics and flashy jewellery, and none of them smell great. But they do smell expensive. Behind the musk of sweat and wool are sharp notes of clove, amber, maybe even saffron. It's a scent wall, applied in defence of their social standing. Somewhere nearby, a dog lets out a sigh loud enough to rattle the bench beneath you. Dogs are everywhere in the castle, big ones shaggy and half-tame. They roam freely, eating scraps, scratching at fleas, and yes, relieving themselves in corners when they're not chasing the kitchen cats. No one seems bothered. In fact, it's considered lucky to have them around. But luck, as you now know, smells like warm fur, damp stone, and very old sausage. Now let's peek into the castle's most notorious feature, the garderobe. This is the medieval version of indoor plumbing, or, more accurately, indoor dropping. A garderobe is a small stone closet with a hole in the seat and a long vertical shaft. Below, if you're fortunate, your waste drops into a cesspit or moat. If not, It lands in a chute where it piles up until some unlucky servant is sent to shovel it out. There's no flushing, no water, just gravity, rats and despair. And yes, the smell comes back up. What's worse? Some guardrobes are cleverly built into the castle's outer walls, which means cold drafts come right up with the stench. You freeze your backside while trying not to breathe. Some people kept sprigs of herbs in these little chambers, pressed into cracks or tied to nails to mask the smell. It didn't work. It never worked. Guardrobes were how castles dealt with waste, but they were also how castles shared it. The aroma travelled through the stone, into corridors and straight to your bedchamber. Speaking of which, you're finally shown to your room. It's small, cold and sparsely furnished. There's a bed with a feather mattress, a wooden chest and some curtains that might have been red once, but now look vaguely burgundy by grime alone. You sniff the pillow and instantly regret it. Feathers, mildew, a hint of stale ale. The mattress has absorbed years of bodies, sweat, farts, fevers, possibly childbirth, and it remembers. Blankets are wool, scratchy, and smell like the fireplace in a very old inn. Some historians suggest that castles were relatively clean compared to the rest of the medieval world. After all, they had servants, systems, even designated waste areas. But relatively clean in the 13th century still means smells like wet dog and dead fish, just less intensely. And don't forget the draft problem. Castles were notoriously hard to heat. Wind whistled through cracks in the stone, so people huddled near fires or under heavy blankets, which meant even less fresh air circulation and more sweat. More clothes being worn for days, more bedding going unchanged, more stink. Let's not skip the kitchens. You pass one on the way to your chamber and immediately understand why the main hall reeked of charred meat. The kitchen is a sensory riot. Bubbling cauldrons, sizzling pans, the smell of burnt bread, singed hair and old blood. There's no concept of clean as you go. You prepare food in the same place you butcher animals and toss scraps. In one corner someone's gutting a goose. In another, a boy is trying to stomp out a small grease fire. The smell is overwhelming and oddly metallic, like a forge that occasionally serves pie. Now here's your quirky fact. Some castle designers included a wardrobe near sleeping chambers, not for clothing, but to store linens and scented herbs. The idea was that the space could absorb some of the room's moisture and keep garments smelling slightly less awful. Of course, if someone stored raw cheese in there by accident, as apparently happened more than once, it quickly became the opposite of fresh. A few curious debates surround whether castles had to be so smelly, or if the aristocracy simply didn't care. Some say it was inevitable. Too many people, too little air, too many animals, and no understanding of bacteria. Others argue that for all their wealth, lords and ladies lived closer to their livestock than we'd ever tolerate today, because animals were security, food, warmth, and trash disposal. Whatever the case, castles weren't the sweet-scented fortresses of fairy tales. They were cold, smoky, and filled with a quiet but constant funk that soaked into stone and fabric alike. You finally lie back on your hard mattress, wrapping yourself in the musty embrace of history. Somewhere, a servant is scrubbing a hallway with vinegar and curses. Outside, the wind howls through the battlements, and the castle, grand, impressive, and ancient, sighs back with the combined breath of centuries. You close your eyes, nose half buried in the pillow, and realise with a kind of sad clarity, even surrounded by luxury, the Middle Ages never quite stopped smelling like survival. You wake up in your castle chamber stiff and groggy, with a mouth that tastes like boiled cabbage and soot. The fire's long gone out, leaving only cold air and the lingering scent of whatever crawled into the hearth last night and died. But today, you're not staying put. No lounging in the great hall. No idle walks through herb gardens pretending not to breathe too deeply. No, today you're travelling, out onto the open road, where things surely have to smell a little better, right? No chamber pots, no garderobes, no rush-stuffed floors. Just open skies, fresh fields, and the noble freedom of the medieval traveller. Except, you guessed it, travel in the Middle Ages didn't smell like freedom. It smelled like livestock sweat, human filth, rotting food, and whatever unfortunate things had died along the road that week. It turns out you're about to take the world's slowest, bumpiest, and most aromatic road trip, with 0 pit stops, 0 showers, and a seating arrangement designed by someone who definitely hated you. Let's start with your transportation options. If you're wealthy, you ride on horseback or in a cart drawn by oxen or mules. If you're not, you're walking. Most people are walking. And when I say walking, I mean trudging through muddy roads lined with dung, urine, broken cartwheels, discarded shoes, and the occasional pile of horse bones no one bothered to move. It's not just unpleasant underfoot, it's alive. The roads are sticky, uneven, and every step you take kicks up tiny clouds of dust and manure particles. Your boots, already crusted with city funk, take on a whole new level of gritty, ankle-high horror. If you're lucky enough to get a seat in a wagon, congratulations! You're now sitting inches from sacks of onions, barrels of fish, bundles of hay, and the unwashed bodies of fellow passengers who've been travelling for days. The cart is creaky, jolting over every rock and rut, and the canopy above your head traps the smell in like a slow cooker of despair. A child sneezes behind you, a goat bleats from under a sack, someone farts unapologetically, and there's no breeze, just you, the funk, and 30 miles of unpaved road to go. One commonly overlooked part of medieval travel was the smell of the pack animals themselves. Horses, donkeys and oxen were not clean creatures. Their bodies generated immense heat and sweat, and the combination of old leather harnesses, wet fur and fly-covered manure was enough to turn your stomach. And don't forget, there were no stable stops. You didn't pull over at a medieval rest area. You stopped when the animals couldn't go anymore, and wherever that was, they relieved themselves freely. Roadside puddles were often equal parts rainwater and animal waste, and travellers walked right through them. Meals on the road? Not a pleasant diversion. There's no medieval equivalent of a fresh baguette and bottled water. Most travel rations were dry and pungent. Hard cheese that smelled like a barn roof, dried meat that gave off a hint of decay, and ale that ranged from sour to explosive. Fruits and vegetables were rarely fresh and often bruised, and bread went mouldy in less than a day. The worst part? You couldn't even escape the scent of your food. You had to carry it, all of it, on your person, meaning your satchel reeked of fermented barley, crushed garlic, and whatever salted fish meant that week. At night, you might stop at a roadside inn, if you're lucky. If not, you camp. And camping means curling up next to a fire surrounded by strangers, listening to wolves howl in the distance and trying to ignore the smell of your travel companion's boots roasting too close to the flames. If you do find an inn, congratulations again. You've now entered a whole new category of stink. Medieval inns were loud, crowded, and mostly unregulated. You walk into a common room, and immediately your nose is assaulted by the scent of sweat-soaked bedding, sour ale puddles, muddy dogs, and something greasy frying over a fire. Probably eels. The beds are shared, sometimes with strangers. You pay for a space on the mattress, not privacy. And the mattress. It smells like the last 20 people who laid on it. Think old body odour, fleas and damp wool, topped off with the faint perfume of mildew. You try to sleep, pressed between a snoring merchant and a woman who's clearly been on the road for 3 weeks longer than you, and all you can do is hope the rats stay on the floor tonight. Now for your fringe fact, some travellers carried their own herbs not just for health, but for smell defence. Sprigs of sage or lavender might be tied to your cloak or stuffed into your shoes. Others used scented cloths, wrapped around their mouths and noses, especially when travelling through plague-ridden areas. Think of it as the medieval version of a travel-size air freshener, except it doesn't plug in. It just wilts slowly over time while you sweat. There's a scholarly debate about whether travel was considered a cleansing act, metaphorically speaking. Pilgrims often saw their journeys as penance, a spiritual shedding of worldly comforts, which is poetic and all, until you're 6 days into a barefoot trek across dung-slick roads with open sores on your feet and a cloaked stranger coughing up blood in the tent next to you. But maybe that's the point. Travel was suffering. It was supposed to be hard. And the stink? Well, that was the smell of the soul being tested. Let's not forget water. Clean drinking water was not guaranteed. You might refill your flask at a roadside stream, assuming you can find one that isn't clogged with algae, dead frogs, or used for animal bathing. Many travellers opted for weak ale or wine instead, which didn't taste much better but at least reduced your chances of dying from dysentery. It's the kind of beverage that fills your mouth with a sour film and your nose with notes of barn loft meets expired grape. So now, halfway through your journey, you sit on a log under a tree, chewing a piece of dried beef that tastes like someone's belt. While your cloak steams gently in the rising sun, you stink. Your clothes stink, your food stinks. The animal tied to your cart stinks. The air stinks, though maybe slightly less than in the city. And yet, oddly, this is considered a good day. You're not dead. You're not stuck in a flooded road or vomiting up bad cheese. You're on the move. And the smell of travel, as nauseating as it is, carries with it a sense of motion, of purpose. And as the wind picks up slightly, rustling the leaves overhead and carrying with it a breeze that smells only faintly of manure, you start to dream of arriving somewhere, anywhere, somewhere with walls, maybe even a clean bucket of water. But you know better now. You know the truth. Wherever you're going, it's going to stink, just differently. You've survived the road. Barely. Your knees are shot. Your boots are one good puddle away from total collapse, and the inside of your cloak smells like a boiled rodent wrapped in onions. But at last, you've reached your destination. A bustling little market town. It looks lively. Stone buildings, thatched roofs, carts rattling over cobblestones, and the distinct murmur of people selling, arguing, singing, and probably pickpocketing. You make your way toward the inn, already imagining the sweet release of a wooden bench and a slab of bread that doesn't smell like your armpit. But before you get too comfortable, your stomach growls. It's time to eat. And what you're about to experience is one of the most nose-punching realities of medieval life. The smell of food gone very, very wrong. Let's just rip off the bandage. There's no refrigeration. None. Cold storage is a pit in the earth. Maybe a stone-lined pantry in the cellar, but it won't keep food fresh for long. If it's summer, meat starts turning in hours. If it's winter, your bread freezes solid, and cheese sweats in a way that feels morally wrong. The result? Most of what people eat has either been dried, pickled, salted, smoked, or spiced within an inch of its life. And even then, it's teetering on the edge of edible. You step into the market and instantly regret it. The stalls are crammed close together, and each one has its own signature odour. One is selling fish, not fresh fish, but salted herring that's been sitting in a barrel since, last harvest. The brine keeps the worst bacteria at bay, but the smell is a meaty, sour slap to the face. Next to that is a butcher's stall where flies have declared full ownership. Cuts of beef and mutton hang from hooks, some still oozing. The blood seeps onto the wooden counter where it mixes with dust and the juice from last week's pig trotters. You try to breathe through your mouth, but that just means you can taste it, and that's just the meat. The cheese booth might be worse. There's hard cheese, safe enough, though it smells like a wet boot. But then there's soft cheese that's been left to mature in a cloth-lined crate. You lift a sample, sniff it, and immediately recoil. It's sharp, sweaty, and oddly floral, like someone spilled perfume in a stable. A woman next to you pops a piece into her mouth like it's nothing. She gives you a look that says, rookie. Fruits and vegetables don't get a pass either. Sure, some look fresh. But then you spot a stack of apples, each one covered in a film of dust and bruises so deep they look like battle wounds. A few have worms poking out. You wisely skip those. You move on to the onions, which have started sprouting green fuzz, and carrots that are bendier than moral standards at a tavern. Everything's just slightly off, and everything smells sweet, sour, earthy, or just plain rotten. The market is a bouquet of decomposition, and you're standing in the middle of it with a hungry stomach and nowhere else to go. Let's not pretend medieval cooks didn't try. They absolutely did. Spices were used not just for flavour, but to hide the taste, and more importantly, the smell of food that had passed its prime. Pepper, cinnamon, clove, saffron, ginger. These weren't just culinary choices, they were self-defence. A stew might contain 5 different meats and 10 different spices, not because anyone had a refined palate, but because you needed to make sure no one noticed the venison had turned last Thursday. Here's a fringe fact. In some regions, meat was legally required to be sold on the same day it was slaughtered. There were meat days where fresh cuts were available, and everything else was leftovers. Did people follow the rules? Hilarious. Absolutely not. Vendors rubbed old meat with salt or vinegar to revive the colour. Some even soaked it in milk or boiled it in ale to soften the smell. Nothing says culinary confidence like boiling your dinner in beer because it otherwise smells like roadkill. And then there's the ale itself. You duck into a tavern and order some bread and drink, hoping for a break from the horror show. The bread is dark, coarse, and has a faint scent of sourdough mixed with... Wait, is that mildew? You pick at the crust, discovering a patch of what might be green mould or might be a very enthusiastic herb. The ale arrives, frothy and cloudy, and the smell makes you hesitate. It's sharp, sour, and just shy of vinegar. You take a sip. It's not bad, but it's not good. It's lukewarm, unfiltered, and full of floating sediment. Still, it's safer than water. Water can kill you. Ale might just make you gassy. Some scholars argue that the smell of medieval food was actually a helpful cue. People developed instincts about what was edible and what wasn't. Others believe they simply had stronger guts and fewer options. If the meat's not actively crawling off the table, it's probably fine. A little mould, scrape it off. A weird tang in the stew, probably just the onions, or the cabbage, or the fish stock, or the squirrel. Nobody's keeping track. Even in noble households, food didn't escape the rot. Castle kitchens weren't immune to spoilage, and because nobles insisted on elaborate meals with dozens of dishes, some courses sat out for hours before being served. By the time the third round of roasted game birds hit the table, they'd been soaked in a thick sauce of spices and sugar to cover the fact that they'd begun to turn. What you're really tasting is clove-pickled bird corpse, but the clove is so nice. You finish your meal, such as it is, and step back outside. The sun's higher now and the heat isn't helping. The smells have bloomed, richer, heavier, and absolutely committed to making your eyes water. The fishmonger is pouring old brine into the street. A man nearby is selling pies with fillings that smell like wet fur. A dog snatches a loaf of bread and runs off, tail wagging, leaving behind a trail of crumbs and what might be sausage grease. And still, people eat. They eat with enthusiasm, with full mouths and loud slurps. They're used to it. They've built up a resistance. For them, the smell of food is just part of the scenery. For you, it's a reminder that in a world without fridges, food has an expiration date. And you can definitely smell when it's been ignored. The bread is sitting like a rock in your stomach, and the ale has given your mouth a thin, sticky coating that refuses to go away, no matter how many times you try to swallow it down. You step out of the tavern and decide, for reasons only desperation can explain, that what you really need right now is a nice conversation. Maybe some laughter, human connection. You know, a break from rotting meat and vinegar-scented sweat cloaks. So you head toward the small crowd gathered in the square near a travelling scribe, with a stack of parchment and a barrel of ink. But the moment someone turns to greet you, smiling, cheerful, you're struck by a smell so specific and horrifying, you involuntarily take a step back. Because tonight, we are delving into a realm even worse than spoiled food, the mouth. Welcome to the age of rotting teeth and deadly breath. It starts innocently enough. The man chatting with you is friendly, toothy, and clearly a fan of onions. He laughs a lot, which is unfortunate, because every burst of laughter is also a burst of hot, putrid wind straight from the medieval digestive tract. His teeth are yellowed, irregular, and loosely clinging to his gums like they're afraid of commitment. He's missing at least 3. Another one appears to be black at the root, and when he smiles wide, you see something green stuck between his molars that might have been food, or possibly a new life form. Dental hygiene in the Middle Ages was rudimentary at best and apocalyptic at worst. People cleaned their teeth by rubbing them with cloth, occasionally using ashes or crushed herbs to scrub away plaque. Toothsticks, early versions of toothpicks, were common, but brushing, flossing and rinsing as we know it simply didn't exist. There were no dentists in the modern sense, just barber surgeons who would, when requested and for the right price, yank your teeth out with metal forceps and zero anaesthesia. The smell of their workshops, blood, sweat, brandy and regret. And the results of this dental neglect, catastrophic. Tooth decay was rampant, gums bled easily, abscesses swelled and burst. You'd be surprised how many medieval folks died from infections that started with a toothache, and in the days or weeks leading up to those deaths, their breath, already bad, became something almost holy in its foulness. People spoke of corpse breath, a sign that a person was rotting from the inside out, which, medically speaking, was accurate. One popular cure for toothache involved holding a mixture of vinegar and crushed mint leaves in the mouth, spitting it out, then burning a feather and inhaling the smoke. If the pain didn't stop, you were advised to get drunk and let a friend pull the tooth out with a rag wrapped around it. Assuming the tooth didn't shatter or break halfway through, you'd be fine. But more often, it led to infection. and the infection came with pus, swelling, and a scent that was described in some texts as foul enough to choke angels. Fun fringe fact: there were some early attempts at mouth fresheners. People chewed on parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, and even small twigs from aromatic trees. The idea wasn't to clean the teeth so much as overpower whatever stench was currently oozing out of your mouth like a curse. Did it work? Sort of. Temporarily. Until you burped up whatever you'd eaten for dinner, and then it was back to square one. As you wander the marketplace, you realise everyone's breath is part of the sensory landscape. The baker smells like yeast and something faintly sour. The stable boy's breath is the olfactory equivalent of sweaty socks soaking in mead. A young woman who offers you a slice of plum tart greets you with a smile that hides nothing. Her breath is all honey and rot, like jam smeared on mouldy bread. And because people talk close, like really close, you get the full effect. There's no such thing as personal space, especially when your only hope of communicating over the noise of the crowd is to lean in and shout directly into someone's facial orbit. It's not just individuals. Certain buildings have their own mouth-breath level problems. Monasteries, for instance, are places of quiet reflection and the occasional dental tragedy. Monks didn't talk much, but when they did, you could tell who'd been hoarding bad teeth. Even scripture couldn't mask the smell of rotting molars, especially in rooms where ventilation was more spiritual than practical. There's a scholarly debate about how tooth health varied by class. Some argue that peasants, with their simpler diets, actually had better teeth than the wealthy, who indulged in sugary confections imported at enormous cost. Early sugar, think sticky, unrefined and rare, was a luxury that rotted your mouth faster than it impressed your guests. Nobles loved it, their teeth did not. Meanwhile, peasants eating coarse bread, onions and root vegetables might keep a few more teeth into their 30s, if the grindstone grit in their flour didn't file them down to nubs. Another point worth noting: many people didn't associate bad breath with uncleanliness. It was often considered a normal part of being alive, like body odour or dirty hands. Only when it became overwhelming, when someone's mouth began to smell like a back alley fish boil, did it register as a problem. And even then, the solution wasn't better hygiene. It was distance, or prayer, or in extreme cases hiring a physician to examine your tongue and maybe bleed you from the neck because, of course, your humours were probably off. And yet, despite all this, people kissed, courted, fell in love, got married. Mouths met other mouths, sometimes during dances, sometimes in alleys, and no one fell over dead from the fumes. People got used to it, the way you're getting used to it. You can now carry on a conversation with a man whose gums are visibly inflamed and whose breath smells like he's been drinking onion ale straight from a boot, and you don't faint. That's growth. You finish your stroll exhausted from the sheer number of nasal assaults. You've survived the fish market, the cheese cart, the garlic vendor, and a travelling preacher who delivered a sermon so forceful his breath nearly parted your hair. And now, as you sit on a low stone wall, watching the sky turn pink over the rooftops, you realise something both comforting and deeply unfortunate. Your own breath probably isn't much better. You haven't brushed your teeth in weeks. You've chewed stale bread, dried mutton, and whatever passed for greens last night. You've sipped vinegar ale and coughed out smoke from a nearby cook fire. You're part of the problem now. You sigh, your breath puffing visibly in the cool evening air, and it smells like survival. A little sour, a little sharp, but honest, human, medieval. And in this world, that's probably the best you can ask for. You've endured bad breath, rotten cheese, and the kind of stew that smells like it was cooked in someone's shoe. But tonight, the tone shifts. There's shouting in the distance, the clatter of iron on iron, and a rising heat that isn't from the sun. You follow the sound and find yourself on the edge of something most people never forget once they've seen or smelled it. War. Not the romanticised, banner-waving, trumpet-blaring kind. This is the real deal. A battlefield brewing on a patch of churned-up earth, and it smells like blood, sweat, panic, and the raw scent of something very close to death. You arrive just as the skirmish is ending. The ground is a mess of broken weapons, crushed grass, and crumpled bodies. Some are moaning, others are not. The smell hits you in waves. First, iron, metallic and sharp from open wounds and spilled blood drying in the heat. Then sweat, thick and acrid, rising off bodies that have been fighting, running, screaming for hours. You've smelled sweat before, but this is different. This is armor sweat. Leather, wool, and human exhaustion marinated together, sealed inside a breastplate that hasn't been cleaned since it was forged. Armor doesn't breathe. It traps everything: body heat, moisture, fear. Soldiers emerge from battle soaked not just in their own fluids, but everyone else's too: blood, spit, sometimes worse. You see a man writhing on the ground, trying to peel off his chainmail shirt, and underneath it his tunic is black with sweat and something leaking from a nasty gash. His skin is a mosaic of grime, gore, and bruising. You don't just smell him, you feel it, the way the odour clings to the back of your throat like thick smoke. Nearby, a group of squires is tending to wounded knights. They're hacking off ruined pieces of clothing with dull knives and pouring wine onto wounds. It smells awful. The wine turns pink, then red, then dark as it soaks into the wounds. Pus and blood mix freely, and with it comes the stink of infection. Already. Some wounds were clean cuts, but many were jagged tears, bone deep. You hear a man screaming as his leg is cauterized with a hot iron. The smell of burning flesh rises, thick and unmistakable. A few people gag, one faints. The man passes out mid-scream. You're glad for him. One of the stranger facts about medieval war is how much logistical stink it generates. It's not just the battlefield, it's the camp. A few hundred men sleeping, eating and relieving themselves in the same rough patch of ground with no toilets, no water but the nearby stream, which now runs pink with blood, and no concept of sanitation. The camp smells like wet wool, spoiled meat, and overflowing chamber pots. Not to mention the latrine trench, if one was even dug at all. Often soldiers just picked a spot behind a tree, behind a tent, behind you. You pass a wagon filled with discarded gear, bent shields, broken helmets, blood-soaked padding. It smells like rust and rotting leather. One of the helmets still has the hair caught in it. You look away quickly, and then you come upon the worst, the dead. Bodies, laid out in rows or piled in makeshift heaps. Some are already beginning to swell. Flies dance across their faces. The air is thick with the unmistakable stench of early decomposition, sweet and sickly, undercut with something earthy and wrong. You've smelled death before in alleys and pits and back rooms. But this is worse. There's so much of it. The quantity changes everything. The battlefield doesn't just smell bad, it smells haunted. You watch as a priest moves among the corpses, swinging a censer full of incense. You catch the hint of frankincense and myrrh, trying its best to push back against the tidal wave of rot. It fails, of course, but you understand the attempt. When you can't fix the smell, you try to bless it. A few women from the local village arrive with carts, tasked with collecting the wounded, or what's left of them. They wear scarves over their faces, not for modesty, but to block the smell. One of them pulls a bundle of herbs from her pocket and presses it to her nose as she lifts a limp arm. Her eyes water anyway. Here's a fringe detail you wouldn't expect. Medieval armies sometimes used latrine duty as punishment. Digging the pits, clearing the waste, dragging the bodies. It was all part of camp discipline, and those who failed in battle or disobeyed orders were often sent to work knee-deep in the stink of their own failure. You look at the trench now, half full, half overflowing, and think, there's worse fates than death. And this is one of them. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about the psychological effects of battlefield stench. Some suggest the overwhelming sensory overload, smell especially, contributed to what we'd now call PTSD. Soldiers became numb not just from the horror, but from the sheer saturation of it. The sounds, the blood, the stink. Others argue that medieval fighters were so used to filth that the battlefield was just an extension of normal life, turned up to 11. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but what's certain is that no one walked away from it clean. Not in mind, not in body, and definitely not in scent. As night falls, the battlefield grows quiet. The moans die down, the torches flicker. A few campfires glow in the distance, cooking something that smells alarmingly like boiled rat. You wrap your cloak tighter around you and sit on a rock, surrounded by the echo of violence. The air is thick and still, even the birds have left. And then a breeze picks up. Not a fresh breeze, there's no such thing here, but one that stirs the scents already hanging in the air. The iron tang of blood, the sour breath of sweat, the meaty sweetness of death. You take it in, slow and shallow, and try not to gag, because this is war, And war, like everything else in the Middle Ages, comes with a smell you'll never forget. Morning arrives sluggishly over the battlefield, casting a pale, indifferent light over the churned earth and broken bodies. The fires have gone out, the groaning has quieted, and the stink, still, here, still thick, still part of everything. But today you're not lingering with the wounded. You're heading into town away from the carnage, though you're about to walk into a different kind of olfactory gauntlet. Because tonight, your journey takes you into the underbelly of medieval industry. Tanning, blacksmithing, candle making, brewing, all the noble trades that powered society, and made sure everything around them smelled like despair soaked in acid. Let's start with the tanners. You smell them before you see them. They're always downwind of the rest of the town, often near a river or stream, tucked just far enough out of sight that you can pretend their work doesn't exist. But your nose knows. The air turns sour, eye-stinging, sharp with ammonia and decay. You round the bend and there it is, the tannery. Hides hang from wooden frames, stiff and dripping. Some are soaking in barrels filled with a revolting stew of water, lime, and, you guessed it, urine. Human urine. Collected in jugs and vats from chamber pots all across town. Some homes even sold their donations to the tanners. It was known as chamber lye. The ammonia in the pee helped break down the fat and hair on the animal skins, making them easier to scrape clean, and scrape they did, by hand, with curved knives, on wooden beams stained with years of blood, grease and God knows what. You watch a tanner at work, his arms deep in a barrel of soaking hides. His hands are permanently stained a colour somewhere between liver and soot. He's not wearing gloves, because gloves haven't been invented yet for this job, and also, no one would waste leather on that. His apron smells like dead cow and strong vinegar. The whole yard is a sensory attack. Flies buzzing, vats sloshing, workers grunting, and that nose-curdling mix of wet fur, rot, and fermented pee rising in waves from every corner. Let's be very clear, tanning wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The chemicals, if you can call lime and urine chemicals, burned skin, got into cuts, and caused infections. Workers often had ulcers, boils, and rashes that never healed. The stink followed them everywhere. Tanners were sometimes forced to live apart from other tradesmen. People refused to stand downwind of them at market. Their children were teased. They were vital to society, but socially they were lepers in leather aprons. One lesser-known but equally nose-wrecking profession? The soap boiler. You wander past a stall and see a man stirring something that looks like porridge in a cauldron. But the smell? Not breakfast. It's hot fat, usually from animals, mixed with lye. Lye, which came from ashes and sometimes caustic urine, created a chemical reaction when boiled with the rendered fat. The result? Soap. Sort of. It was greasy, crumbly, and smelled faintly of bacon mixed with ashtray, but it worked, sometimes. And while better than nothing, the process of making it made the air thick with burning hair and scorched bone. Right next door is the candle maker. You're thinking beeswax and gentle light. Number, that's for churches and kings. Most people use tallow candles, made from animal fat. The fat was melted, filtered, then cooled in moulds or dripped slowly over wicks until the candle thickened. When burned, tallow gave off a warm glow, and a smell like hot meat and sweaty shoes. You walk past a few candles on display and realise you'd rather sit in the dark. Feeling brave, you continue down the row of shops to the dyer's corner. Big wooden vats bubble with mysterious liquids. Blues, reds, deep browns. It should be beautiful, right? Except the dyes were often made with things like urine, fermented roots and stale wine. And for black dye? That required iron and tannins, often extracted from oak galls, which are basically insect-produced tree growths. The air smells like rust, mouldy grapes, and a hint of something pungently botanical that you'd rather not identify. But the grand prize for worst-smelling profession may belong to the fullers. Fullers were responsible for cleaning and thickening newly woven cloth. And how did they do that? By stomping on it. In a vat. Filled with fuller's earth, a type of clay, and you're going to love this, more urine. They trampled the cloth barefoot for hours, like some hellish version of a winemaking dance. And when you walk past their workshop, you can smell the result. Damp wool, body odour, and the sharp, sour tang of pee that's been sitting in the sun all day. It's the scent of industry, yes, but also a powerful argument for not wearing clothes at all. Let's pause for a fun, if deeply disturbing, fringe fact. In some places, people collected dog droppings for use in leather treatment. That's right, dog poop. It was called pure and was believed to soften hides. Workers kept piles of it outside their shops, scooping it up with wooden shovels and stirring it into vats of soaking skins. The smell of the pure yard? A blend of sour milk, wet fur and broken dreams. There's an ongoing academic debate about whether people working these trades truly acclimated to the smells, or whether they just learned to ignore them. Some evidence suggests they developed stronger tolerances, while others argue they suffered from constant sinus infections, headaches and worse. Either way, you now understand why many of these workers were segregated from the rest of society, not by law necessarily, but by sheer self-preservation. As the sun starts to dip, the industrial part of town settles into a kind of smoky, exhausted silence. The tanners tie off their hides and douse their fires. The candlemaker stacks his wares, now reeking faintly of lard, and you, stumbling away from the carnage with your cloak pulled tightly over your nose, realise something incredible. The battlefield was actually better, because this is daily life. These aren't soldiers or plague victims. These are tradesmen, craftspeople, pillars of the community. They make the boots, the belts, the coats, the soap, the candles, the dyed cloth, the harnesses, the very things that keep this society running, and they all smell like various stages of rot. You trudge back toward the inn, your senses battered, your stomach unsure of what decade it lives in. And as you pass a man walking with a fresh hide slung over his shoulder, still dripping, still steaming, you catch a whiff so specific, so profoundly awful, that your brain stops registering it as a smell and just reclassifies it as trauma. By now, your nose has suffered every indignity possible. It's been assaulted by battlefield rot, market day fish slime, tanner's lye, and the charming combo of breath and body odour worn proudly by the peasant class. You're starting to think there's nothing left to shock you, but tonight, oh tonight, you're dipping into the weird, the fringe, the sticky underbelly of medieval belief. Because when science and medicine fail, and when prayer doesn't cut it, people will turn to the only thing left, magic. And in the Middle Ages, that often meant smelling things that, frankly, no one should ever smell by choice. You find yourself in a cramped cottage on the edge of a village. It leans like it's trying to whisper secrets to the ground, and the inside is dark, warm, and filled with the scent of every herb you've ever heard of, and a few you wish you hadn't. This is a healer's hut, or a wise woman's hut, or depending on who you ask and what day of the week it is, a witch's hut. And here, the line between medicine and magic is as thin as the air, thick with smoke and curiosity. Your eyes adjust and you see bundles of dried plants hanging from the rafters. Mugwort, wormwood, sage, lavender, garlic, rosemary. Some are familiar, others aren't. In the corner is a small cauldron bubbling with something grey-green and suspiciously lumpy. The smell wafting from it is unique, like mouldy mint mixed with boiled leather and a hint of pine. The woman stirring it waves you over, unbothered by the flies circling overhead. She hands you a rag soaked in the mixture and tells you to press it to your chest. For protection, she says, from spirits, from sickness, from smells. You smile and pretend it's working even as your eyes start to water. Medieval remedies were often based on what we'd now call folk magic. Illness? Maybe your humours were unbalanced, or maybe you looked at the wrong star on the wrong night, or maybe, and this is where the real fun starts, you were cursed. And if you were cursed, you needed more than herbs. You needed smell-based defence strategies. One of the most popular protective items was a charm stuffed with herbs, flowers, spices, and, if you had access, bits of animals. A dried mouse, a spider wrapped in silk, a piece of mole foot. These were sewn into little packets and worn around the neck or hidden in clothes. The theory, the stink or magic aura would repel evil. The reality, you now smelled like a garden exploded inside a butcher's shop. Let's not skip the truly strange ones. One so-called cure for fever involved sniffing a mixture of burnt chicken feathers and horse dung. Another suggested that if you carried a dried toad, yes, a whole toad, on your person, it would draw illness out of your body. Some people ground up dried dog poop, called album graecum, if you want the Latin version that somehow makes it worse. and mixed it with herbs and wine as a treatment for sore throats or infected wounds. And yes, it was used externally and internally. The smell? Imagine licking the inside of a kennel during a heatwave, then multiply it. You might be wondering, did any of this actually work? In a few rare cases, maybe. Garlic has antibacterial properties. Burning herbs can deter insects, but most of these cures worked on hope and fear, which, to be fair, are powerful medicines. People needed to do something. Smelling foul concoctions felt like fighting back. One fringe belief was that illness entered the body through the nose, not through air, but through smell itself. A bad scent could carry the devil, or a demon, or some lurking miasma with malicious intent. That's why so many protective rituals involved scent. People lit candles made with herbs. They sprinkled holy water mixed with lavender. They washed babies in onion broth. They wore amulets stuffed with flowers and kept bowls of vinegar near windows to catch the sickness. You're basically living in a room that's part apothecary, part death-scent panic bunker. You lean over a table where dried herbs have been laid out in careful rows. The healer points to each one and names its function. Basil for protection, rue for exorcism, dill to ward off witches, yes, even the nice ones, and fennel to keep away ghosts. Some bundles have bones tied into them. One has feathers. Another smells so strongly of sulphur you immediately take a step back. She tells you it's for banishing bad dreams. You're not sure if she means yours or someone else's. The room gets smokier. She throws a handful of herbs into a small brazier and fans the smoke toward you. It's sharp and sour. Vinegar-drenched sage, maybe, or boiled radish skin. She mutters something under her breath, then pats your head like a confused aunt trying to exorcise a migraine. You're not sure whether to be grateful or deeply concerned, but the smell is so overwhelming that you can't focus long enough to decide. There's a scholarly debate over how seriously people took these rituals. Some say it was desperation. People clung to anything when the plagues came. Others believe these traditions were woven deeply into the culture, handed down through generations not just as superstition, but as identity. These smells, foul, earthy, wild, weren't just tools, they were language. And let's not pretend this was just a rural thing. City dwellers, nobles, even physicians dipped into the same smelly remedies when needed. Rich ladies wore pomanders with herbs to protect from bad luck. Priests burned stinky incense to clear evil spirits. Surgeons cleaned wounds with strong wine and chewed garlic before treating patients, believing their breath would purify the air. People used stink to fight stink. It was smell-on-smell warfare. Let's not forget the love potions. Oh yes. These often included crushed flowers, yes, but also hair, sweat, and in more adventurous recipes, bodily fluids. The smell was said to be intoxicating, irresistible. What it really was, biological chaos in a flask. Someone hands you one to sniff. You recoil. They laugh. They say love is powerful. You nod and try not to hurl. The room is swirling with scents now. Sweet, bitter, sour, smoky. Your nose is numb. Your clothes smell like you rolled through a compost bin. But when you step outside, the air feels oddly light. Maybe the rituals did something. Or maybe you've simply passed through a new layer of olfactory hell and emerged on the other side. You breathe deeply, and for once the wind just smells like horses and old cabbage. The wind shifts again as you leave the wise woman's hut behind, and now the town seems almost calm. A few birds sing from the rooftops. A baker is sweeping soot from his doorway. The cobblestones are damp from last night's drizzle, and for a moment the air actually smells tolerable, like wet stone and burnt flour. You think, maybe I've made it. Maybe the worst is behind me. And then you hear it, the distant ringing of a bell, low and slow, tolling out across the rooftops. Not a church bell, not a wedding bell. This is the kind of bell that means only one thing in the medieval world: death. And just like that, you're on your way to meet the single most infamous stench in all of human history, the smell of plague. You follow the sound toward the edge of town, where a crude wooden barrier has been hastily thrown up. A small cluster of homes sits beyond it, eerily still. No children running, no dogs barking, just silence, and the occasional thud of something being thrown into a cart. A man in a brown robe stands by the barrier with a rag tied over his mouth and nose. He sees you and waves you back. "Don't come closer," he says. "It's in there." It is the Black Death, bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, though no one knows that name yet. All they know is that when it comes, people bleed, swell and die fast. And it stinks, not just a little, not just rot or sweat. The plague has its own signature smell, an oozing bloody bile-sour reek that clings to walls and clothes and skin. It's the scent of your body turning against itself, cell by cell, hour by hour. You sneak around the barrier anyway. Curiosity outweighs common sense. The first thing you notice is the smell of decay, but sharper than usual. It's not just the dead, it's the living. Plague victims sweat heavily, sometimes bleed from their mouths or ears, and develop blackened sores and gangrenous tissue that gives off a smell like wet charcoal mixed with rotting meat. It's not quiet here, despite the stillness. Behind closed doors, people groan, cough, whimper. You step past a cracked window and catch a flash of movement. A child crouched in the corner, eyes wide and vacant. The smell leaking from the room is so thick it makes your tongue feel coated. Down the street, a wagon rolls by. Two men, faces covered, are loading it with bodies. Not all of them are fully dead. One groans weakly as he's lifted by the arms, ignored. The bodies are wrapped in stained cloths, but the smell still escapes. Putrefaction and urine and something worse. The driver mumbles a prayer with every corpse he loads. When the wagon's full, they roll away, leaving behind a streak of fluid that soaks slowly into the dirt. You catch sight of a house where the door has been marked with a crude red cross and a few Latin words scrawled above it. God have mercy. Inside, a woman lies on a straw pallet, twitching. Her face is slick with sweat, her lips cracked. The air inside is humid, oppressive, filled with the sour tang of fever and waste. She's surrounded by bowls of herbs, but nothing's helping. You step back out, gagging, the heat of the room clinging to your skin like a damp rag. Here's the grim twist. People knew the smell meant death was near. Entire medical texts were written about plague odour. They called it pesty odour, a scent so noxious it could carry death in itself. People believed that just inhaling the air near a plague victim could kill you. And while they were wrong about the mechanics, they weren't entirely wrong about the risk. Fleas and rats were the real carriers, but the stench, that was the warning. By the time you could smell it, it was usually too late. A fringe belief during outbreaks was that extremely bad smells could drive out the plague. That's right. More stink as protection. People burned sulphur, leather, even old shoes. Some walked around with dead birds tied to their belts. Others wore masks stuffed with herbs, vinegar-soaked sponges, or even dung if they were desperate. Anything to keep the plague air from entering their bodies. One man walks past you with a bundle of burning straw and a dead cat hanging from his belt. He nods politely. You nod back, trying not to breathe. There's another debate here, one still going in dusty corners of academia, about how much these plague smells shaped public memory. Did the horror stick because of the death toll? Or because it stank so fiercely that the scent became part of the trauma? Some argue that the sense of smell is the most emotionally charged of all senses. You can forget a face, but not a smell, especially not one tied to mass death. And in medieval towns, the smell of plague lingered. It soaked into wood, clothes, soil. Long after the bodies were gone, people still smelled the memory. You step into a small chapel where a few people are gathered, praying through cloth masks, eyes red from smoke and fatigue. The air is heavy with incense, not the pleasant kind, but sharp, bitter, meant to cleanse and cover. The priest waves the censer back and forth like he's trying to erase the very molecules of plague from the room. It doesn't work, but you appreciate the effort. Everyone in the room smells like fear. Outside again, a woman is burning her own furniture. She says it's the only way to rid her house of death. You watch the flames eat through a chair, a spinning wheel, a cradle. The smoke is acrid, stings your nose. Mixed with the scent of burning wood is a darker, oilier smell. You don't ask what it is. And then finally, the wind shifts, just a little. You smell something faint, wet leaves maybe, river mud, something alive. You follow it out of the quarantined street and back toward the town proper. The bell has stopped, the wagon is gone, the smell stays with you. Because here's the truth. No other moment in medieval history had a smell so feared, so recorded, so viscerally human. It was the smell of helplessness, of bodies giving up, of families locked indoors to die together. It changed how people thought of death, and it embedded itself into the very timbers of every building that survived. You walk back slowly, nose clogged, stomach hollow, unsure if anything will ever smell clean again, and honestly, you're not sure it should. The smell of the plague doesn't leave you. Even as you re-enter the safer parts of town and try to distract yourself with the more normal medieval stinks, wood smoke, livestock, boiling cabbage, it's there, clinging to the fibres of your cloak, tucked into the seams of your memory. But you keep walking because there's something else you want to see, maybe even need to see after all that. A little joy, a little colour, a little spectacle. And so, you follow the noise and find yourself at the edge of a fairground, where entertainers, merchants, jugglers, and crowds of curious townsfolk are swaying under banners and music. The medieval fair is in full swing. But don't let the loots and laughter fool you. This place reeks. And not just from the livestock tied to a post near the pie vendor. At first it seems festive enough. A fiddler plays a crooked tune while a boy beats on a drum that's seen better centuries. There are ribbons and coloured cloths strung between posts, smells of cinnamon wafting from a baker's cart, and a man selling apples dipped in something vaguely sweet. But then you start to move through the crowd, and it hits you. The fair doesn't smell like joy. It smells like people. More specifically, people crammed together, sweating in layers of wool and linen, most of whom haven't bathed in a month, and some who've just finished wrestling a pig. Let's break it down. The first wave is body odour. Thick, warm, and ancient. Everyone here is layered up, even in the sun. Shirts, doublets, gowns, cloaks. You brush past a man with a red beard and immediately regret it. His armpit radiates the scent of stale beer and wet goat. A woman next to you lifts her arms to cheer on a juggler, and your nose is gifted with an aromatic blend of garlic, tallow, and what might be last winter's onions still trapped in her chemise. It's not just individuals, it's a collective funk. The fair is a human stew, simmering slowly under the afternoon sun. Then there's the animal presence. Horses, oxen, goats, everyone brought something. Some are for show, others for trade, and a few are there to be sacrificed at some vaguely spiritual game booth you don't ask too many questions about. They're all doing what animals do, sweating, farting, and leaving behind wet piles that are only partially scooped into the nearest ditch. You sidestep a mound that's attracting more flies than the apple stand. Someone shouts that the dog got into the butter again, and a small scuffle breaks out near a cart full of hens, feathers, and curses flying. You pass a tent where a street performer is doing fire-breathing tricks. The air around it smells like oil, singed hair, and something vaguely alcoholic. The performer spits a burst of flame into the air and the crowd roars. Unfortunately, so does his breath. It wafts over the front row like a fermented punch in the nose. Nearby, a vendor is frying pastries in tallow. You'd be excited, except the oil's clearly been reused far too many times. It smells like someone deep-fried regret. You chew anyway, out of politeness, and immediately wish you hadn't. The outside's crispy, the inside tastes faintly of lard, dust, and raisin. Now let's talk about the real entertainment, the public performances. You come upon a makeshift stage where a group of actors is putting on a morality play. Everyone's in costume, sweating profusely, wearing masks that haven't been washed in months. One actor is covered in fake sores to represent sin, and unfortunately some of those sores are leaking something that smells accurate. The play involves a lot of yelling, collapsing dramatically, and dying noisily. All of this takes place beneath the unfiltered medieval sun, and the odour radiating from the stage is equal parts sweat, grease paint, and fabric mould. A few feet away is something truly special, the bear pit. It's less a pit and more a rope circle, where a large, miserable bear is chained to a post while men goad it into growling. The bear stinks, like spectacularly, wet fur, musk, spoiled meat. You don't even want to know what's in the bucket of food nearby. It's a mix of animal blood, grain, and mystery meat. Children stand nearby, delighted. You back away slowly, trying not to breathe. And then there are the people who really commit to their roles. The fools, jesters, and so-called smell vendors. Yes, that was a thing. Some folks sold scented cloths or pomanders, little balls filled with spices or resin, to help you survive the day. One woman offers you a scrap of cloth soaked in rosewater. You sniff. It's okay. A little spoiled, a little vinegar heavy, but it's better than the alternative. You tie it around your wrist and thank her. ignoring the fact that her hands smell like raw garlic and something pickled. Here's your fringe fact of the day. Some entertainers actually use smell in their acts. One jester had a routine involving a pig bladder, a torch, and a strategically placed pile of cow dung. The finale included an explosion, a cloud of smoke, and the audience ducking for cover as the smell hit. People screamed, laughed, cried. It was considered the height of comedy. There's some scholarly back and forth about whether these festivals were always this smelly, or if some were better managed. Wealthier towns might have designated clean zones. Others simply didn't care. The fair was a chance to cut loose, and if you left smelling worse than you arrived, that was part of the charm, or trauma, depending on how your stomach handled the combination of goat sweat, old cider, and bear breath. You sit near a puppet booth and try to take it all in. The air is thick, not unbearable, but close. Everything smells familiar now, every category of medieval stink layered together like a stew. It's not pleasant, but it's oddly comforting. You're part of the crowd now. You smell like them. They smell like you. You're no longer a visitor. You're an active participant in the grand, grimy symphony of medieval merriment. As night falls, lanterns are lit. The smell of smoke replaces some of the animal funk. Music picks up. A boy next to you offers a chunk of roast meat on a stick. You accept, because hunger finally outweighs fear. It's greasy, salty, and tastes like it was cooked over a fire that had other things in it besides wood. Still, you chew, you swallow, you smile, and then a pig pees on your boot, because of course it does. Morning breaks slowly after the fair, dragging a greyish light over the fields and streets, like a damp blanket thrown across the whole town. The laughter is gone now, and what's left is the hangover, both physical and olfactory. You walk through the town square where revellers lay passed out against barrels, cloaks soaked with ale and possibly worse. The festive stink of last night has curdled into something sour and grimy, like cider left in a boot under the sun. But today isn't about celebrating. Today, you're going to church. Now don't get too excited. Yes, churches are cleaner than tanneries. They're quieter than fairs. But are they better smelling? That depends. Churches in the Middle Ages were deeply sensory places, echoing with chant, bathed in candlelight, and, relevant to our topic, layered with competing smells. Some were lovely, most were not. And as you step through the heavy oak door of the local parish church, you're hit with a scent you weren't expecting. Damp stone, wet wool, beeswax, and something sharp and musky, like forgotten incense filtered through a monk's laundry pile. It's darker inside than you expected. High, vaulted ceilings trap smoke from candle flames, and a few stained glass windows let in filtered, dust-laced beams of light. The pews are rough, worn by centuries of elbows and knees, and the smell at first seems sacred. There's a faint sweetness to it, from the beeswax candles flickering at the altar and the dried lavender bundles tucked near the door. But the longer you sit, the more the background odours assert themselves. Body odour again makes an appearance. Parishioners packed in for morning mass, shoulder to shoulder in woolen layers that haven't been washed since Michaelmas. You're stuck between a woman who smells like cabbage stew and mothballs and a man with a beard so thick it could house livestock, and possibly does, judging by the faint smell of straw. Their combined scent rises with the heat of the building. There's no ventilation, no open windows. The only relief comes when someone near the back door coughs loudly enough to merit a little fresh air. And then, of course, there's the incense. Frankincense and myrrh, burned in a swinging censer by the priest as he moves through the aisles, blessing everyone with curls of fragrant smoke. The idea is spiritual cleansing, symbolic purification. But practically, you're just being smothered in a dense fog of spicy, resinous perfume. If you've already got a headache, which let's be honest you do, it's not helping. Some folks love it. Others cough into their sleeves, trying not to breathe too deeply. And if you're sitting near the front, it gets in your hair, your cloak, your mouth. You will taste that incense all day. Here's a quirky twist. Church floors were often strewn with rushes or straw, especially in colder months to help with insulation. Sounds nice, right? Except those rushes weren't cleaned regularly. People tracked in mud, animal droppings, and all the delightful remnants of everyday life. Over time, the rushes absorbed everything. Wine spills, candle wax, sweat, and the occasional vomiting toddler. The scent was less holy sanctuary and more heavily used livestock stable, but with better acoustics. Then there's the side chapels, little alcoves where personal shrines and relics are kept. You duck into one, hoping for some peace, and instead find the air thicker than ever. It smells like old cloth, burnt oil, and something unsettlingly fleshy. That's when you spot it, a reliquary, a finger bone, allegedly from a saint sealed in a glass and gold box. Relics like these were hugely important and deeply revered, but not always stored under ideal conditions. Some decayed, some leaked, some were soaked in oil and never properly cleaned. You lean closer, sniff cautiously, and recoil. Nope. That's definitely not a scented candle. Nearby, a priest tends to a brazier filled with burning herbs, sage maybe, or juniper. These were used not just for religious symbolism but for fumigation. Churches, especially during outbreaks, became places where the sick were brought to pray, confess, or die. And where there are dying bodies, there are smells. The smoke was meant to drive out both evil spirits and the lingering scent of mortal bodies giving up the ghost. You imagine the mix: sweat, incense, dying breath, and scorched herbs. Holy, maybe, palatable, hardly. And let's not forget the clergy themselves. Monks, nuns, priests, they often lived in communal dormitories with little washing. Their robes were woolen, reused, and rarely laundered. One chronicler described a monastery's smell as damp cloth and tired lungs. Another noted that confessionals, those small wooden boxes, could be nearly unbearable in midsummer. You duck into one now, just for the experience, and instantly regret it. It's dark, musty, and reeks faintly of breath, mildew, and what might be dried tears, possibly yours. There's a long-standing scholarly debate about whether churches felt cleaner because of the rituals. Some argue the frequent burning of incense and use of herbs helped suppress bacteria, even without anyone knowing why. Others say it just masked the scent temporarily, like spraying perfume into a poorly ventilated closet. What's clear is that churches were trying. They had an aesthetic, a sensory philosophy. But even the divine couldn't fully overpower the smell of unwashed humanity crowded together for hours at a time. You slip out after the sermon ends, blinking in the daylight, your hair now permanently scented with holy smoke. You pass a group of older women murmuring prayers, and another group of children kicking a ball made of stitched rags. The scent of the church follows you for blocks, clinging to your clothes, your skin, your very soul. By the time you reach the edge of town, you realise something unsettling. You kind of miss the smell. Not enjoy it exactly, but it's familiar now, reassuring, in a strange way. It's a scent that says, you're part of this. It's not clean, but it's known. It's shared. And for better or worse, that smoky, musty, beeswax and body funk blend is what Faith smelled like. You turn back for one last look. The bell tower rises above the rooftops, and beneath it the scent of old rituals curls upward into the sky. You breathe in, out, and keep walking, because there are worse smells waiting, and you, by now, are ready for them. You've passed through nearly every medieval stink imaginable: cities and fairs, warfare and food stalls, churches and back-alley butcheries. But now, with evening descending and your senses dulled by fatigue and exposure, you're heading toward one final realm of odour, the one most intimate, most persistent, and, let's be honest, most personal, the medieval home. You might assume that, after tanneries and battlefield corpses, nothing so humble as a family cottage could faze you. But then you step inside and your nostrils immediately issue a formal complaint to the rest of your body, because this place, the average home, smells like a centuries-long stew of sweat, soot, spoiled milk and desperation. It starts at the door. There's no porch, no buffer zone. You open the wooden panel, probably hung slightly crooked on leather hinges, and walk straight into one of the most aggressively fragrant environments in Europe. The cottage is one room, maybe two if you're lucky, with low beams that have soaked up every smoke-filled winter since the day they were installed. The scent of old fires hangs in the rafters like an invisible curtain. Wood smoke mixed with dried fat, old ash, and the occasional feather stuck to the ceiling like some weird ancestral curse. To your left there's a straw-stuffed mattress on a wooden platform. Well, a pallet, really. No sheets. Maybe a fur if you're doing well. It smells like a human being has slept there every night since the invention of sleep. And that's because one has. Probably several. It's not just one person per bed. It's multiple. Mom, Dad, kids, sometimes even Grandma if she's still breathing. Every one of them sweating through linen shifts wrapped in cloaks, farting into the night and sharing the same 10 square feet of air. The straw beneath them hasn't been changed in months. You crouch to sniff against your better judgment and instantly regret it. There's mould, body oil, and the unmistakable ammonia whiff of dried urine. Small children don't always make it to the pot at night, and the straw, well, it's absorbent. It's also full of lice. Not visible to you, but you feel them crawling just from proximity. One family remedy for lice involves sprinkling ashes and crushed wormwood into the bedding. That helps with the bugs. Not so much with the smell. There's a hearth in the centre, and above it a blackened pot hangs from a hook. Tonight's dinner is boiling in it, and the scent is unenthusiastic. A watery blend of cabbage, leeks, and something that may or may not be turnip. The broth has absorbed flavours from weeks of previous meals. Stew never really ends, it just evolves, and now it carries an aroma somewhere between boiled socks and wet moss. You dip a spoon in and give it a sniff. Nope, that turnip's turned. The family dog, if they have one, is sleeping in the corner on a scrap of cloth that used to be a blanket and now smells like old soup, and worse decisions. The dog scratches himself and yawns, releasing a breath that could be weaponized. Nearby, a chicken wanders freely, occasionally squatting in places you'd rather it didn't. And in the far corner, behind a threadbare curtain, you find the family's toilet, if you can call it that. It's a wooden bucket, possibly with a lid, definitely without a sense of shame. Medieval households didn't always empty these daily. Sometimes they were dumped in the garden, sometimes out the back door, sometimes into the nearby stream. And when it was cold, they stayed inside, all night, marinating. You lift the lid and nearly lose your vision. The smell is sharp, deep and surprisingly sweet, which somehow makes it worse. One popular fringe belief was that keeping waste indoors in winter helped contain the cold, like trapping heat in a room. Some even thought bad smells pushed out illness. Yes, that again. Miasma theory was the dominant medical model for centuries, and so rather than being grossed out, some folks actually encouraged strong household smells. Better to live with a goat indoors than risk letting evil airs come in through a cracked window. You consider this as you breathe in goat, dog and sour cabbage stew all at once, and try not to scream. Let's not skip the cleaning process, because there really wasn't one. Floors were swept with birch branches or just stomped into submission. Floors might be earthen, packed with rushes or straw, which, as we've discussed, become compost piles within days. You spot a few crushed bones, an old spoon, something that might have been bread 3 weeks ago. All of it mashed underfoot into a spongy, fragrant carpet of domestic chaos. And then there are the people. They're not filthy by their own standards. Most bathe when they can, rinse their hands in basins, wipe faces with cloths soaked in vinegar or lavender water. But without modern plumbing, clean is a relative term. Hair is greasy. Teeth are questionable. Clothes are worn until they rot or are patched beyond recognition. Everyone here smells like the inside of their clothes, and those clothes smell like firewood, animal hair, tallow soap, smoke, and all the meals they've cooked while wearing them, and there's still no ventilation. You open a small wooden shutter, and immediately someone complains. Too cold, they say. The devil rides in the wind. So you close it again, and return to your cosy, airtight room full of smells that have been gently fermenting since before you were born. Scholars often argue that the medieval nose was different than ours, not biologically, but socially. People simply notice different things. They had different thresholds. What we would call offensive, they might call normal, familiar, homey. And maybe they're right, because as you sit by the hearth, the pot bubbling, the dog groaning in his sleep, the youngest child gnawing on a hunk of bread that smells like feet, you realise something horrible. You're used to it now. It's not that the stench has gone, it's that your brain has waved a little white flag and stopped caring. You breathe in and recognise the ingredients: sweat, lard, mildew, dung, soup, and possibly disappointment. But you don't gag. Not this time. You lean back, stare into the dancing fire and realise that somehow, impossibly, this place has become normal. Maybe even cosy. You wake before dawn, cocooned in a room that smells like every phase of life. Birth, sweat, stew, sleep, repeat. There's no rooster crowing. Instead, it's the collective stirring of the household. Shuffling feet, a grunt here, the creak of floorboards as someone heads for the door with the chamber pot sloshing ominously. Your nose, now an old war veteran, registers all of this without even flinching. You've become a medieval bloodhound. Congratulations. But don't get too comfortable, because this final chapter isn't going to offer relief. It's going to explain how things finally started to change, and how it took centuries of stink, science, screaming, and slow burn revolution to claw our way out of this nose-punishing nightmare. You step outside, drawing in a breath of cool air tinged with wood smoke and livestock. It should be refreshing, but your lungs now demand more. Clean air, modern air. And believe it or not, the Middle Ages, this entire long, smelly slog was the turning point. Not because they figured everything out, but because they hit rock bottom. And from there, well, things had to go somewhere. Let's rewind just a little. By the late Middle Ages, people were already experimenting with better ideas. Soap making became a legitimate trade. In some cities, bathhouses tried to regulate cleanliness, though they also became popular hangouts for less than wholesome activities, leading to their eventual closure or moral rebranding. You're probably wondering if people actually understood that filth and disease were connected. They didn't, not in the germ theory sense, but they did start noticing that certain smells came right before outbreaks. People didn't understand bacteria, but they absolutely understood that foul odours and illness like to hold hands. That's why cities slowly began to experiment with sanitation. Emphasis on slowly. London started implementing street cleaning ordinances. Paris enforced where butchers could throw their offal. Some towns banned dumping chamber pots out of windows, though enforcement was laughable. You remember that corner you passed 3 days ago where something hit your boot? Yeah. That rule hadn't reached that neighbourhood yet. Still, it was a start. The idea that maybe the street shouldn't double as a toilet began to creep in. Now here's a little-known fringe detail. In 14th century Italy, the city of Pistoia passed what some scholars call one of the first public health codes in Europe, banning the transport of infected clothing, regulating burials, and yes, trying to cut down on the smells. The smell of plague was taken so seriously that cities passed laws about what herbs should be burned in the streets, and officials known as plague wardens were tasked with keeping public spaces at least less unbearable. It wasn't exactly progress by today's standards, but for them, it was revolutionary. Personal hygiene began to crawl out of the mud as well. Nobility started using linen underclothes more regularly, changing them with some frequency, and washing their hands before meals. Perfumes became less of a cover-up and more of an expectation. Still strong, still spicy, but now with prestige attached. Barbers started offering tooth scraping and face washing, services, not just haircuts. And while there was still a long way to go before daily showers and minty fresh breath, people at least tried, and trying mattered. Another fun fact: the printing press played a weird role in all this. With books came the spread of ideas, not just religious or philosophical ones, but medical ones. Hygiene manuals circulated. Doctors debated miasma versus bodily humours. New translations of ancient Greek and Roman texts emphasised cleanliness as a civic virtue. Did people instantly adopt better hygiene? Of course not, but the knowledge was there, fermenting in the minds of those wealthy and literate enough to read. It was the long con of public health, planting the seeds for a cleaner, less apocalyptic-smelling future. But honestly, the real catalyst for change: urbanisation. The more people crammed into tighter spaces, the harder it became to ignore the consequences of filth. You could turn your nose away from your neighbour's BO, but not from the cholera outbreak that started 2 streets over because the well got contaminated by a leaky cesspit. Industrialisation may have brought its own slate of horrors: smog, chemical runoff, overcrowded tenements. But it also forced governments to take public health seriously. Sewers, running water, waste management. These weren't invented in the Middle Ages, but they were demanded by the mess the Middle Ages left behind. By the 19th century, cities had public sanitation departments. Soap became mass-produced and widely available. Toothbrushes stopped being a luxury item and started showing up in homes that hadn't seen clean fingernails in generations. And as germ theory gained ground, we finally stopped blaming smells alone for illness, and started washing our hands because we knew why it worked. The scent of progress was, well, not perfect, But at least it wasn't old cheese and feet anymore. But here's the kicker. Even now, echoes of medieval stink survive. Some of the herbs used to cover smells then, lavender, rosemary, clove, are still in your soaps, your perfumes, your shampoos. Your favourite earthy candle probably smells suspiciously like a 12th century herb bundle. You avoid spoiled food with the same instincts that once made peasants gag at bad stew. And deep in your brainstem there's still that ancient survival switch that says that smells bad, run. So you made it. You trudged through the filth, waded through the sludge, gagged through the stew, and survived the breath, the butchers, the battlefield and the bedbugs. You stared into the olfactory abyss, and somehow it stared back, smelled your armpit, and nodded in recognition. And now, standing on the edge of this smelly, soot-streaked world, you get it. The Middle Ages weren't just brutal, they were rank. Filth wasn't an accident. It was a way of life, shaped by belief, poverty, ignorance, and occasionally some impressively misguided science. And yet, people lived. They adapted. They built cities, prayed in incense-soaked chapels, kissed each other with rotten teeth, and somehow managed to find joy, even in a world where stepping outside meant dodging excrement and ducking under a pig. Your nose may never be the same, but your perspective? That's crystal clear. Cleanliness isn't just comfort, it's civilization, and we only got here by walking through centuries of really, really bad smells. So, you're still here. Your lungs are working, your stomach hasn't entirely betrayed you, and against all odds your nose hasn't fled your face in protest. You've walked the alleyways of medieval cities, squeezed into church pews next to sweating pilgrims, ducked chamber pots, gagged through battlefield aftermath, and sniffed your way through herbal apothecaries that smelled like witches' pantries left out in the rain. And you didn't just survive the most foul-smelling era in human history, you understood it. You lived it, nose first, and you'll never smell rosemary the same way again. The truth is, we often look at the past through a romantic lens. Castles, knights, flowing gowns, candlelight. But none of that came fragrance-free. Every silk-draped noble, every sermon-humming monk, every beer-swilling peasant carried a cloud of odour that was just as much a part of their identity as their title or trade. The Middle Ages weren't just dirty, they were sensory chaos. And at the heart of that chaos was smell. And yet, people found love. They made families. They danced at fairs. They sang in smoky taverns. They prayed through clouds of incense and kept going through plagues, droughts, famines and winters so cold the toilet bucket froze solid. For all the stench, there was stubborn, sweet humanity in it, even if that humanity needed a good bath. Now, when you go back to your world of deodorant, hand sanitizer, air purifiers, and citrus-scented laundry soap, maybe take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come. That breath of fresh air when you step outside your door, that's luxury. That hot shower, a miracle. And your toilet that doesn't require a wooden lid and a prayer, that's civilization, baby. So, before you snuggle deeper under those covers and drift off to dreams far less pungent than tonight's story, here's your takeaway. Bad smells might make life uncomfortable, but history, it's never sterile. It's sweaty, sooty, sour, sometimes sweet, and always stubbornly real. Sleep tight. Keep your nose clean.